In 1944, a doctor covered a deceased patient's body with a sheet and then wheeled their stretcher out into the hallway. The morgue at the Oregon State Hospital was already full, so the doctor planned to put this body in the chapel. But when he pushed open the chapel doors, there were already so many stretchers with dead patients with sheets on them inside that there was no room for this patient. The doctor closed the chapel's heavy wooden doors and just stood there, his mind racing. More than 400 patients had fallen violently ill in the past 12 hours, and dozens had died. The doctor had no idea what the cause was, and if he couldn't figure it out, he knew more bodies would be joining the ones already lining the inside of the chapel. From Ballen Studios and Wondery, I'm MrBallen, and this is MrBallen's Medical Mysteries, where every week we will explore a new baffling mystery originating from the one place we all can't escape, our own bodies. If you liked today's story, please invite the follow button on an African safari, but before you go, make sure you sneak 27 raw steaks into their backpack. This week's story is called Blood Feast. It was late in the afternoon on November 18th, 1942. A cook named Mickey McKillop opened the lid of a giant metal vat, then asked his volunteer sous chef, 27-year-old George Nosen, to carry it over to an industrial oven. Mickey and George were starting to prepare dinner for almost 500 patients across 5 wards at the Oregon State Hospital, a public mental facility for psychiatric patients. Tonight's menu was scrambled egg yolks and toast, and Mickey, along with his boss, Mary O'Hare, were the only 2 cooks on duty. The hospital had been understaffed for a year now, ever since the United States entered World War II. Many members of the nursing staff had left to volunteer for the war effort. During the day, there was about 1 attendant for every 16 patients, but at night, that number swelled to 1 attendant for every 150 patients. Mickey and Mary were so desperate for help in the kitchen that they had started asking trustworthy patients to help them prep for each meal. And one of those trustworthy patients was Mickey's volunteer sous chef, George Nosen. George placed a frozen 16-pound canister of eggs onto the countertop beside the oven. Mickey liked George, and he felt a little sorry for him too. George's parents had originally brought him to the hospital for help with his epilepsy, which is a disorder of the brain characterized by repeated seizures. At this time, people were just beginning to understand how epilepsy actually worked. George's parents most likely saw it as a mental condition, which is why they brought him to the state hospital. They probably didn't think he was crazy, they just wanted help with getting his seizures under control. But during George's initial evaluation, the staff psychologist would diagnose George with paranoid schizophrenia, and then they had George involuntarily committed for life. Mickey didn't understand how that was possible. He'd never seen George hallucinate or get aggressive like the other patients with schizophrenia, but there was nothing he could do about it. And if he was being honest with himself, he was glad to have someone so mild-mannered and easygoing to help him in the kitchen. Mickey yanked the lid off the canister that George had just set down, revealing hundreds of thawing egg yolks. These days, a lot of the hospital's food supply came from federal surplus deliveries, since the government was rationing food to help the war effort. The egg whites were used in food that was sent overseas, and hospitals stateside got the leftover yolks. It was time to start cooking, so Mickey dumped out the canister into the metal vat. He repeated the process 2 more times until the stovetop was crowded with thawing eggs. He handed George a cup and asked for water, and then he lit the stovetop so the eggs would warm faster. He let George dump the water into the vat, then the 2 of them started slicing bread loaves. Once they were done, Mickey turned on the oven and laid all the bread slices across the metal grates to be toasted. Then he turned his attention back to the eggs. They were finally thawed, so Mickey asked George to grab some powdered milk. It was the only thing that made the egg yolks creamy enough to scramble. As Mickey stirred the eggs, he sent George to fetch something else, postum powder, a caffeine-free coffee substitute they'd been getting from the government over the past year. Mickey even let George mix the drink himself, He'd never let a patient touch an actual dinner item before, so Mickey took a quick sip just to be safe. The postum tasted like chalk, which meant it was made correctly. He clapped George on the back and told him he'd done a great job. But that momentary taste test distracted Mickey just long enough for the eggs to start burning. Mickey cussed as he turned off the stovetop, wondering how to fix this. He threw in a palmful of salt and then gave the eggs a stir, and then they looked good as new. When dinner was finally done, Mickey and George portioned the eggs and toast into buffet dishes and then loaded them onto a big cart for delivery at each of the 5 dining halls spread across the hospital's wards. By the time they got to Ward 5, hungry patients lined the hallway outside the cafeteria, urging Mickey and George to please hurry up. Finally, a bell rang and the lines began to move. From behind the buffet table, Mickey watched as the patients ladled scrambled eggs onto their plates. He helped serve them each a piece of toast, and then sent the patients to sit at the long metal tables that ran the length of the dining hall. And as the patients all dug into their food, Mickey heard someone call out that the eggs were too salty. Mickey winced and felt bad because he knew he very well could have oversalted them. And while Mickey was worrying about the eggs, another patient in the room took a long swig of postum and then started to choke. One of the nurses walked over to pat the patient on the back, but instead of swallowing, the patient keeled over and threw up on the nurse's shoes. The nurse shrieked, and Mickey looked over and saw a red streak on the ground. It took him a second to realize that it wasn't vomit, it was blood. The patient then fell backwards onto the floor, and those around him began to scream. The nurse bent over and tried to steady the man, who was now having a seizure on the floor. Mickey ran over to help her, but before he could make it, another patient sent a spray of red blood shooting across the table. Mickey shouted for everyone to stop eating. But his warning came too late. More patients began throwing up blood. Others collapsed onto the floor, writhing in pain. Mickey didn't know what to do, so he just tried to catch patients as they fell. One nurse ran into the hallway and sounded an alarm. Mickey stooped over a patient who was clawing at his own face, saying he couldn't feel it. His lips were swollen and blue. He tried to help the man return to his seat, but the man collapsed back down to the floor and started saying that his legs were paralyzed. Mickey was totally horrified and his hands trembled with fear, and he had no idea what could cause this terrible reaction people were having. Dr. William Lidbeck had just finished dinner when his phone rang at his home on the hospital grounds. When he picked it up, all he heard on the other end was screaming and shouting. Then a panic-stricken nurse got on the line and begged him to run up to the hospital. Patients across 4 of the 5 wards were collapsing, they were vomiting blood, and now losing feeling in their faces and limbs. Dr. Lidbeck dropped his fork, ran out his front door, and tore across the lawn, heading for the side entrance of the main hospital building, 100 yards from his cottage. With every step, the screaming he could hear grew louder. It sounded like every patient inside of the building was in agony. Moments later, the doctor flung the door open and stepped into the hallway, and the scene that greeted him was horrible. The hallway was full of patients sitting on the floor with their backs up against the wall, coughing blood into their laps. One man had been strapped to a gurney in the hallway, spasming wildly, blood running down the front of his shirt. His entire mouth was swollen and drool collected at the side of his lips. A nurse ran into the hallway and beckoned Dr. Lidbeck to come quickly. He followed her through a doorway into the cafeteria, where he saw dozens of patients writhing on the floor. The nurse that Dr. Lidbeck had followed dashed ahead of him. She knelt down beside one of the patients and started spoon-feeding him baking soda. Dr. Lidbeck caught up to her and asked what was going on. She admitted that the nursing staff had no idea what had caused this outbreak, but it had started right after the patients had begun their dinner. She didn't know how to reverse it, but she was just hoping that baking soda would help alleviate their stomach pain. The entire staff was running around in complete panic, trying to manage symptoms. Dr. Lidbeck took a deep breath and tried to push down his rising fear. He'd never dealt with sudden illness on such a massive scale, but he knew that he couldn't do anything without the proper equipment. He had to get his medicine bag from his office on the second floor. He instructed the nurse to keep working, then ran out of the cafeteria and down the hallway. He turned the corner into the 3rd ward, where the scene was exactly the same. It was full of patients covered in their own blood, writhing on the floor. Dr. Lidbeck had always prided himself on having a steely stomach, but this felt unbearable to watch. He rushed through the hallway, stepping over sick patients as he went, and ran up the stairs to the second floor. But as he left the stairwell, he stopped dead in his tracks. The atmosphere in this ward was completely different. The hallway was empty. If it weren't for the screams echoing from downstairs, it would almost feel peaceful. As he walked past open doors, he saw all the patients tucked in their beds. They looked scared, but seemed to be otherwise fine. Dr. Lidbeck was confused. How was this ward so calm when the rest were full of chaos and vomiting patients? A door opened at the end of the hallway, and the ward's head nurse, Allie Wassel, stepped out and walked toward him. Dr. Lidbeck thought she looked really pale. The nurse seemed very relieved to see Lidbeck, and she would tell him that she thought there had to be something wrong with the eggs from dinner. She said she had taken one bite and they had tasted so spoiled that she ordered all her patients not to eat them, and so her patients were fine, but she had been throwing up ever since. A chill ran through Dr. Lidbeck. He didn't know yet what was causing his patients to vomit blood, but now he knew it very likely had to be related to the eggs. It was the only thing all the patients had eaten that night. But it couldn't just be a case of spoiled food. An egg would have to be so rotten to cause this that it never would have been served in the first place. It would have been obviously bad. Then a realization dawned on him. If the eggs themselves were fine, it meant that something else had been put in the eggs that night. He was glad that Nurse Wassel had not eaten more of them. Dr. Lidbeck told the head nurse that if she started feeling worse, to please come find him right away, and then the doctor ran back downstairs to tend to the sick patients. As Dr. Lidbeck went down a hallway, he passed by the hospital morgue. A nurse was wheeling a covered stretcher inside. One of the patients had died. Dr. Lidbeck's blood ran cold, but he didn't have time to stop and mourn. There were hundreds of other patients still waiting for treatment, and so he didn't have a moment to lose. Hey, it's MrBallen. For the first time, my show, Medical Mysteries, has joined forces with Redacted for a special episode. A redacted medical mystery uncovers how routine surgery leads to classified government operations. Listen now on the Medical Mysteries or Redacted feeds, or search A Redacted Medical Mystery wherever you get your podcasts. Hey, it's MrBallen. I'm excited to tell you about something special. For the first time, my show, MrBallen's Medical Mysteries, has joined forces with Redacted, Declassified Mysteries with Luke LaManna, to tell a story so complex it required our combined storytelling styles. This special episode is called A Redacted Medical Mystery. In it, unexplained symptoms after a routine surgery quickly unravel into something much darker, leading straight to classified government operations hidden for decades. To listen and uncover the truth alongside us, head to either the MrBallen's Medical Mysteries or Redacted show pages right now, or search for A Redacted Medical Mystery in the Wondery app or wherever you get your podcasts. If you're fascinated by unexplained medical stories, well, stick around on Medical Mysteries. Every week, we dive deep into cases that will leave you questioning everything you know about the human body. And if government conspiracies are more your style, Redacted is your go-to for stories that unravel secrets never meant to see the light of day. Remember, you can listen to both shows early and ad-free by joining Wondery Plus. Hey listeners, MrBallen here. What if I told you that some of the strangest, darkest, and most mysterious stories happening right now are all connected to what might be the biggest crime of our generation? You know I'm always on the hunt for the most chilling and perplexing tales out there. Well, I've discovered a new podcast that uncovers real-world mysteries unfolding right now, much like how another Ballen Studios podcast, Redacted, Declassified Mysteries, brings hidden government secrets to light. And it's called Lawless Planet. Host Zach Goldbaum reveals how shocking tales of murder, cover-ups, and mysterious deaths are all part of something bigger: the systematic destruction of our planet. From activists who vanish in the Amazon to whistleblowers uncovering billion-dollar environmental crimes, these aren't just stories about the environment. They're real-life thrillers about people caught between powerful forces willing to kill to keep their secrets buried. Follow Lawless Planet on the Wondery app or wherever you get your podcasts. You can listen to new episodes of Lawless Planet early and ad-free right now by joining Wondery Plus. Hey listeners, big news for true crime lovers. You can now enjoy this podcast ad-free on Amazon Music with your Prime membership. Listen to all episodes of my podcasts, MrBallen's Medical Mysteries and MrBallen's Strange, Dark, and Mysterious Stories, along with a huge collection of top true crime podcasts completely ad-free. No more wading through cliffhangers or dealing with ads, because let's be honest, ads shouldn't be the most nerve-wracking part of true crime. To start your ad-free listening journey, download the Amazon Music app for free or head to amazon.com/ballen. That's amazon.com/BALLEN. Dive into uninterrupted true crime stories today. About 16 hours later, in the late morning of November 19th, Oregon Governor Charles Sprague raced along the highway in his car. An hour earlier, Sprague had heard about last night's outbreak at the state hospital. Now he was on the way to the state capitol, where an emergency State Board of Control meeting would soon commence. From the moment the United States had entered the war, Sprague feared a morning like this. He was worried that the outbreak at the hospital was caused by sabotage, that the country's enemies had deliberately tampered with these eggs. He knew that the Oregon State Hospital received food rations from the government. The frozen eggs had been part of a shipment to the hospital 6 months ago. But those eggs had been separated from a much larger batch. It was entirely possible that someone had poisoned that larger supply, which was then sent around to various institutions throughout the country. Sprague worried that if someone had tampered with the egg supply, anywhere that had received eggs from that batch would suffer a similar attack. Sprague shuddered at the thought of a spy for the Axis powers poisoning innocent Americans. The Food and Drug Administration had already ordered all institutions that received these eggs to immediately stop using them. Sprague's driver stopped the car outside the front steps of the Capitol building. Once Sprague got out, he was greeted by an aide who walked with him up the stairs. The aide had just received word from the hospital. As of 10:30 that morning, 47 patients had died, and their bodies were still lining the hospital hallways, and another 350 patients were violently ill. As governor, Sprague needed to make sure that investigators had the resources necessary to investigate the egg tampering and find out who was behind it. He told the aide that he'd be a few minutes late to the meeting, then headed for his office to call the chief of police in Salem, Oregon, where the state hospital was located. Later that afternoon, the superintendent of the hospital, Dr. John Evans, stood in front of a cage of rats in a laboratory. He was holding a plateful of scrambled eggs. Earlier that morning, a coroner had requested permission to perform autopsies on the patients who had died. Dr. Evans allowed him to take 6 of the dead, hoping the autopsy results could tell him what had happened. A few hours after the coroner had taken the bodies, Dr. Evans received a toxicology report that confirmed his worst fear. The patients had been poisoned. However, nobody knew yet what they were poisoned with or how. The coroner was still running tests. But that was why Dr. Evans was now holding a plateful of the contaminated scrambled eggs that had been served the night before. He was running his own experiment. On a neighboring table, there was another cage of rats and another plate of eggs. But these eggs came straight from one of the egg yolk canisters still in the freezer. A lab technician had thawed them out that morning. They reasoned that if only the first cage of rats died, that meant the poison had been added into the eggs at the hospital. But if both cages of rats died, it meant the eggs themselves had been poisoned before they were shipped to the hospital, and tens of thousands of people could be in danger. Dr. Evans placed each plate of eggs into their respective cages and then waited for the rats to eat. A moment later, the rats in the first cage began to shake violently and foam at the mouth. They squealed in pain, and within minutes, all of them were dead. Dr. Evans looked over at the other cage and saw those rats were just fine. The experiment had worked. It confirmed this wasn't a case of mass contamination or widespread enemy conspiracy. The eggs were clearly just fine when they arrived at the hospital before something or someone poisoned them. But it also meant there could be a mass murderer inside the hospital who was the one who added the poison. Enraged and disgusted, Dr. Evans called the police. 3 days later, on November 22nd, head nurse Allie Wassel, who had ordered her patients not to eat the eggs, sat in Dr. Lidbeck's office speaking to a barrel-chested detective. The investigators had been interviewing every patient and member of staff for the past 2 days, trying to determine who poisoned the eggs. Further testing had revealed that the poison was sodium fluoride, better known as cockroach poison. Detectives had even found some in a basement storeroom, but what they didn't know was how it had gotten into the eggs or who had done it. Allie wanted to help, but she told the detective that she hadn't seen anything suspicious. Until that horrible dinner, she'd been on duty, taking care of patients. She watched the detective as he scribbled something down on a notepad, and she started to feel nervous. Allie assured the detective that the other nurses would confirm her story, too. The detective wrote a few more things down and then looked up at Allie and thanked her for her time and told her she was free to go. Allie breathed a sigh of relief and stood up to leave. As she reached the door, the detective told an officer standing outside to bring in the next person to be interviewed, assistant cook Mickey McKillop. Allie passed Mickey as she was walking down the hallway. He was waiting in a chair outside the office, bouncing his leg up and down. Allie couldn't help but think that he looked anxious, or like a man who was hiding something. By late that same evening, Mickey McKillop had been in Dr. Lidbeck's office for hours. The detective had asked him the same few questions over and over, pressing him about the way the kitchens were run. Mickey thought he'd kept his story straight, but he'd told it so many times now that it was hard to be sure, and he knew he was likely starting to confuse the details. All Mickey wanted to do was sleep. He had a migraine that was making it hard to focus, but every time he closed his eyes, the detective would shake him awake. And so Mickey was feeling like he would do just about anything to make this interview end. It was obvious the police were suspicious of him, and Mickey knew they would not give up until he, Mickey, told the police what they needed to know. So Mickey decided it was time to come clean. Mickey sat up in the stiff wooden chair, and while avoiding eye contact with the detective, Mickey would admit that he did know more than he had told them. Mickey said that he could tell them exactly who had poisoned the eggs. In fact, he had watched it happen, and worst of all, he had not done a thing to stop it. An hour later, Mickey and his boss, Mary O'Hare, were being led from the Oregon State Hospital in handcuffs. A police officer read the charges. Mickey was charged with manslaughter, Mary was charged with accessory after the fact. Then the officer loaded them into a police van. Mickey took one last look at the hospital and caught a glimpse of a few patients staring out the windows, terrified looks on their faces. One of the faces he recognized was George Nosen, the psychiatric patient who volunteered in the kitchen. Mickey shook his head. He knew that what he had just told the detectives would change George's life forever. When Mickey the cook finally told the truth to detectives, he began by telling them about the terrible evening the sickness broke out. While the nursing staff was running around treating all these patients who were vomiting up blood, Mickey saw George Nosen cowering in the hallway, and suddenly Mickey had a terrible thought. He grabbed George and asked him to retrace his steps from that afternoon. Mickey and George mimed preparing the eggs, getting the frozen yolks, lighting the stove, getting some water to help warm them. Then Mickey followed George down the kitchen steps in search of the powdered milk that made the eggs creamy. At the bottom of the steps, there were 2 storeroom doors. Instinctively, Mickey leaned toward the storeroom on the left, which held dry goods, but George led him to the storeroom on the right, which held fruits and vegetables. Mickey felt an icy chill run through him. He watched George turn the key and open the right door. George pointed to a large, unmarked tin canister sitting on the ground inside. It was open and filled with white powder. A scoop was sticking out of the powder like it had just been used. Mickey's stomach dropped, but he tried to look unbothered. He thanked George and sent him to his room. Then he ran back upstairs and grabbed his boss, Mary, and showed her the canister George had just pointed out. Mary went white as a sheet. It was against the rules for Mickey to have given keys to a patient. Mary told Mickey that she did understand why he'd done it. They were so understaffed, he'd been desperate for help. But if anyone found out, they were both done for, and so they agreed to keep it a secret. Mary had kept her promise and said nothing, but Mickey eventually broke and told the story to the detective in Dr. Lidbeck's office. Once the detective got Mickey's confession, they knew who had poisoned the eggs at the Oregon State Hospital and how they had done it. That fateful night, George had taken the keys to the storeroom and headed down to the basement. But he went into the wrong storeroom. He went into the right door, and he brought back a heaping scoop of white powder that he believed was powdered milk, but it wasn't. He then poured that white powder into a vat of scrambled eggs, and in doing so, George had accidentally poisoned his fellow patients with sodium fluoride, aka cockroach poison. To this day, nobody knows why the poison was kept in that storeroom with the fruits and vegetables. In adults, a lethal dosage of sodium fluoride is just 5 to 10 grams, which is a bit more than what you'd find in a sugar packet. Well, George had accidentally spiked the eggs with 5 pounds of poison. In the end, the charges against Mickey the cook and his boss Mary were dismissed. The hospital was held liable since the real culprit was gross understaffing. The only person who suffered any real consequences for the mistake was George, who was unable to leave Oregon State Hospital for another 41 years. George was never the same after that night. He couldn't forgive himself for what he'd done, even if it was just a tragic mistake. The patients who remembered the outbreak bullied him relentlessly for decades. And after a while, George started fighting back. He got into physical brawls on multiple occasions. And then, in 1983, he got into a big altercation with an older inmate, and during it, George was severely injured and died as a result. In early July 2007, so almost a month after Bob's murder, Stepp and McCarrick made the 3.5-hour drive from St. Charles to Kansas City. Once they were there, they teamed up with some local police and then paid a visit to James at his house. James had known about Bob's murder soon after it happened, so he wasn't surprised the police wanted to talk to him. And James did not try to hide anything. He said that he and Bob had met online and had been having an affair for about 8 months. James even showed the police a bunch of love letters and gifts that Bob had given him. Initially, Stepp and McCarrick didn't find anything strange about this. But the more James talked, and the more personal items that he showed them, it started to look like he never threw away anything connected to Bob. And the investigators thought this went past the point of romance and into a possible obsession. Finally, McCarrick asked James if anything in their relationship had changed before Bob was killed. And James said yes, there had been a huge change, because Bob's wife, Diane, had recently discovered an email exchange between him and Bob, and so she'd learned about the affair. After that, Bob told James he would have to cool things off for a bit with them and focus instead on his marriage to Diane. As Detective Stepp and Captain McCarrick made the drive back to St. Charles, they began to realize that they now had a full-on love triangle to consider. There was a chance that James had gotten angry when Bob started to back away from their relationship, and maybe he lashed out and killed Bob. But Diane, who already had a clear financial motive, might have also gone into a rage and murdered Bob because he was cheating on her. Both of those theories made sense, but without any real evidence, Stepp and McCarrick felt like they were just stumbling around in the dark. By the late summer of 2007, Stepp and McCarrick were growing increasingly frustrated with the case. The investigation just kept going the same way it had from the beginning. They had several strong suspects and no concrete evidence. They continued to try to find the Ford Focus, along with some clue that might link Diane, James, or anyone else to the crime scene. But nothing turned up on either front. And as the months passed by, new leads stopped coming in. Other investigations demanded the cops' focus, and so Bob's case started to go cold. Fast forward to April of 2008, 10 months after Bob's murder. Detective Stepp was at his desk when a phone call got transferred to him. He picked up, and he heard the voice of a county forensics officer on the other end, and she sounded excited. As Stepp listened to her, a stunned look came across his face, because things like this just didn't usually happen in investigations. The forensics officer explained that the long shot the team had taken by cutting away Bob's back pocket from his pants had paid off, because now, almost a year later, the process known as touch DNA sampling had taken a massive leap forward. Essentially, in the past, usable DNA samples could only be obtained from bodily fluids. But now, new touch testing methods allowed the lab to obtain DNA samples from skin cells. And so the lab had tested Bob's back pocket, and they found that whoever had taken Bob's wallet out of that pocket had left their skin cells behind. So they now had a sample of that person's DNA. Detective Stepp hung up the phone, still in shock. This case that he'd basically given up on suddenly felt like it was about to be solved, and all because a forensics officer had seen what the future might bring and had saved a pants pocket. Stepp went to McCarrick's office and told the captain about this huge development. And right away, McCarrick got to work reassembling the investigative team. But even with this new DNA sample, it would still take the investigators some time to put everything together. But eventually, they would sit down face to face with the person who had left their skin cells behind at the crime scene. And at that point, Detective Stepp and Captain McCarrick knew who killed Bob Eidman. At 11 a.m. that day, the killer and their accomplice sat in a parked Ford Focus in the lot of the strip mall, just past Bob's office. They each held a gun, and they each had a bandana tied around their neck. At some point, the killer raised their bandana up over their nose to cover their face, and at that point, the accomplice did the same. Then the killer looked over at the accomplice, nodded, and then they both got out of the car and ran up the steps to the second floor of the strip mall. They quickly made it to Bob's office, opened up the door, stepped inside, and shut the door behind them. Bob, who was doing some work at his desk, looked up, but before he could say or do anything, the killer and the accomplice raised their guns, and the killer fired. The bullet grazed Bob on the chin, and he immediately began to scream and put his hand up to the wound, but the killer just moved closer to the desk and fired again. And this shot hit Bob on the neck. Blood poured from his wound as he fell out of his chair and hit the floor. The killer immediately ran around the desk and aimed right at Bob's face and fired the gun again, this time shooting Bob through the eye. Bob would die laying right there on the floor of his office. Once Bob was dead, the killer crouched down and took Bob's wallet out of his back pocket. Then the killer and the accomplice searched the office, looking for cash they knew Bob kept on hand. But they couldn't find anything, and then they heard shouting coming from right below them. And so in a panic, the killer just grabbed Bob's wallet, put it in his pocket, and then screamed at the accomplice that they needed to run. So the two of them fled the office, slamming the door behind them. They went down the steps, got back in the Ford Focus, and the killer hit the gas and they sped off down the street. And when they'd gotten miles away from the strip mall, the killer took Bob's wallet out of their pocket and looked inside of it. The killer took out the cash they saw and handed half of it to their accomplice. Bob Eidman's murderer was not a jealous wife, an obsessed lover, or a business rival. It turned out the investigators' first theory was right. Bob had been killed by someone who simply wanted to rob him. And that was a man named Paul White. But Paul was not a complete stranger to Bob, because Paul's wife was one of Bob's clients. And months before the murder, Paul had gone with his wife to Bob's office when she made a cash payment for her car insurance. So Paul knew Bob must keep cash on hand. On the night before the murder, Paul had lost $1,200 playing blackjack and craps at a casino, and so he was desperate for money. And his solution was he would kill Bob and take all his cash. After staying up all night, Paul got a hold of 2 guns. Then he got his friend, a man named Cleo Hines, to come with him to provide extra muscle. And then the two of them went to Bob's office and killed him and then robbed him. However, they didn't find the cash in Paul's desk drawer, and so they ended up committing this cold-blooded murder just for the money they found in Bob's wallet, which was $300, or after splitting it, $150 each. And they took that money right back to the casino and quickly lost all of it. The investigators had been on the trail of that Ford Focus, which would turn out to belong to Paul's accomplice, Cleo. But after almost a year of searching, they still hadn't tracked it down. But when the crime lab conducted their DNA touch testing on the skin cells they pulled from Bob's pocket, those samples eventually led them to Paul, who happened to be in prison at the time for committing forgery. Investigators were quickly able to connect Paul to his accomplice Cleo and to the Ford Focus they'd seen on the surveillance footage. Bob's wife Diane, who had nothing to do with the crime, would break down in tears during Paul and Cleo's trial. Paul and Cleo were both convicted, and each of them were sentenced to 2 life terms in prison, with no possibility of parole. The next story of today's episode is called The Bear, the Plane, and the Duffel. In early December of 1985, in the Chattahoochee National Forest in northern Georgia, a hunter was very carefully making his way through the trees trying to track a deer. Now, this hunter had been tracking this deer for over a mile, but it had been a while since he had seen any signs of it being anywhere nearby. And as this hunter continued to creep along, he became increasingly aware of how loud each of his steps were, because the ground all around him was covered in dry leaves, and so every step he was taking was creating a loud crunching sound. And so eventually this hunter just came to a stop and decided stalking this deer was totally pointless because he was basically scaring it away with these crunching sounds as he got closer to it. But before this hunter was ready to just give up and head back to his vehicle, he continued on a little bit further, and when he pushed through this particularly dense brush area, he saw this clearing up ahead. And the second he saw what was in this clearing, he froze, took a step back into the brush, and then ducked down behind a rock. Because in that clearing, he saw an animal, and it wasn't a deer. It was a huge American black bear. Now, generally speaking, American black bears are not aggressive towards humans. However, if, for example, you were to accidentally sneak up on a black bear, like this hunter had done, and you suddenly startled it by just showing your presence, the bear might react by pouncing on you and ripping you to bits. And so this hunter, with his back pressed up against the rock and his rifle gripped tightly across his chest, he's thinking about that and wondering what he's going to do to get out of this situation. At first he thought, okay, I'll just stand up and quietly walk away. But then he remembered how loud the leaves were, and even though he had been lucky walking in, he hadn't alerted the bear to his presence. On the way out, he was worried he wouldn't be so lucky, that those leaves would alert the bear to his position. And so the hunter began thinking, okay, well, what if I just stand up and start shooting at this bear? But the hunter knew the big issue with that plan is he had a deer hunting rifle, which is not nearly powerful enough to quickly take down a black bear, if at all. And so if he starts shooting at this bear, there was a very good chance that the bear would just turn around and maul him before he was able to put the bear down with his rifle. And so as this hunter is going through these scenarios behind the rock, he realizes something. He hasn't heard this bear at all. Now, bears in general are very loud animals. Just their regular breathing is so guttural and noisy that you can hear it a pretty good distance away. And the hunter's thinking to himself, I can't hear it breathing, and come to think of it, I haven't heard this bear once since I've been near it. And so the hunter very carefully stood up from behind his rock and turned around, and then he kind of peered forward into the brush, looking back into this clearing, and when he spotted the bear again, he realized immediately the bear was dead. The bear was kind of slumped forward, and its body almost looked like a deflated balloon. The hunter was so relieved, he almost started laughing. And so he stepped out from behind his rock and he made his way through the brush into the clearing to get a better look at this bear. And when the hunter was right over the top of this bear looking down at it, something immediately struck him as very odd. This bear was far too young to have died of natural causes. However, after this hunter kind of poked and prodded the bear and lifted it up on either side to try to look underneath it, he couldn't see any visible injuries. It was like this bear had just randomly dropped dead. But the hunter didn't spend much time thinking about what happened to this bear. Instead, he thought to himself, there has to be some sort of logical explanation for what killed it, and with one last look at the bear on the ground, the hunter turned around and began the long walk back through the woods back to his vehicle. It would turn out there was an explanation for what happened to that bear. However, it was anything but logical. But to get to that non-logical explanation, we first have to go back in time. Around 11:30 p.m. on September 10th, 1985, so 3 months before the hunter discovered this dead bear, two pilots were flying their little 6-seater Cessna airplane over northern Georgia, making their way north towards Tennessee. And as these pilots flew along very casually, they suddenly intercepted over their radio a voice message that they definitely were not supposed to hear. It sounded like other pilots communicating with each other, and what they were talking about was how they were now going to follow this little Cessna airplane that they could see that was currently flying over northern Georgia. Now, radio traffic like this can only really be intercepted if your radio that's doing the intercepting is physically close to the person doing the transmitting. And so knowing this, the two pilots in this little Cessna knew that whoever was talking about following that little Cessna, they had to be talking about them, the two pilots in that Cessna. Now, for most pilots, if you suddenly overheard a radio transmission that your plane was getting followed by some other pilots, you might reach out to those pilots and say, "Hey, why are you following me? What's going on?" Now, the co-pilot of this little Cessna might have wanted to react that way. However, before he could, the main pilot stopped him and said, "I actually know exactly why somebody might want to tail us, and unfortunately, we're both going to have to jump out of this plane." Before the co-pilot could really even react to this news, the main pilot had set the Cessna on autopilot, which sets the plane to fly in a straight direction going at a constant speed at a constant altitude until either a pilot comes back and takes the craft back over, or if it just stays on autopilot, it eventually will run out of fuel and crash or run into something. And so after the main pilot had done that, he turned to the co-pilot and gestured for him to come with him into the main cabin of the aircraft, basically the main body of the craft where all their luggage was. And the co-pilot, he's so confused about what's happening, he's so panicked that he just follows the main pilot. So the two of them, they climb back over the two front seats that go into the main body of the craft, and the main pilot begins strapping parachutes onto some of their luggage. And as he's doing this, he tells the co-pilot to open up the side door of the plane. And so again, the co-pilot is just so caught off guard, he has no idea how to handle this, and so he reaches over and he slides open this door of this moving plane. And as soon as he did, this huge rush of cold night air blasted inside of the cabin, and it became so loud from the howling wind coming in that the two pilots couldn't even talk to each other. And then the main pilot just began pushing the luggage out of the plane just into the night, falling straight down to the ground far, far below them. And at some point, the co-pilot just joined him and began pushing the luggage out of the plane. And then after all the luggage was out, the main pilot shoved a parachute into the hands of the co-pilot and said, put it on. He had to gesture for it because they couldn't hear each other. And so as this co-pilot's struggling to get on his parachute, the main pilot puts on his chute. And then right after the co-pilot has just barely got his parachute on, the main pilot pushes him out the side of the plane, and then the main pilot jumps out after him. So they basically abandoned their plane, which was still set to autopilot, so at some point, it was just going to crash. About 5 hours later, in a suburb of Knoxville, Tennessee, an 85-year-old man named Fred Myers was just waking up. Fred always got up before sunrise. It was part of his daily routine. He would wake up, he would get dressed, he would wash and shave his face, and then he would sit down and read the local newspaper. This simple routine was actually very important to Fred because recently he had been diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease, which is a progressive disease that destroys memory. And so having this sort of set routine helped him manage his symptoms. Basically, at least in the morning, he could go into autopilot and go through this routine and not get confused. However, on this particular morning, something would happen that would leave Fred more confused than he had ever been in his entire life. Fred had made it to his bathroom, he had washed his face, and he had begun shaving when out of the corner of his eye, he noticed something strange outside in his driveway. He could see it through a nearby window, but it was still so dark outside, Fred couldn't tell what this thing was out there. And so feeling very curious, Fred put his razor blade down and he made his way over to the window to get a better look. And when he reached the window and looked out at his driveway and saw what this strange thing was, he could not believe his eyes. There was this huge parachute out on his driveway, and on the parachute was the main pilot of the Cessna. After the main pilot had pushed the co-pilot out and leapt out himself, when he pulled his ripcord, his chute either didn't deploy or when it deployed, it didn't inflate fully, and so he was forced to go to his reserve chute, but it didn't inflate fast enough to stop him from crashing into the ground. And so the main pilot slammed into the ground, basically at terminal velocity, and so he sustained catastrophic internal injuries, and he died within a couple of minutes of hitting the ground. Fred was so stunned and confused at what he was looking at that without saying a word, he just turned away from his window and walked over to his phone and called the police, shaving cream still on his face. When the police arrived at Fred's house that morning, they were expecting to see a dead recreational skydiver on Fred's property. But when they walked up the driveway and saw the dead man for themselves, they knew right away this was not some recreational skydiver. He actually looked more like a soldier. He was wearing a bulletproof vest over some camouflage fatigues, and he had night vision goggles strapped to his head. But the dead man's shoe choice made the police think this guy could not possibly have been military, because on this guy's feet were not military-style combat boots like you would expect with the rest of his getup. Instead, he was wearing loafers, specifically Gucci loafers, so very expensive designer shoes. And so the police are thinking to themselves, who the heck was this guy, and what was he doing? The police would figure that out. However, first, we have to fast forward 2 months to late November 1985, so roughly 2 weeks before that bear was discovered by that hunter in Chattahoochee National Forest. Now, at this point in late November, that black bear was alive and well and living a typical black bear life in the Chattahoochee National Forest, which meant he mostly spent his time wandering around the woods looking for something to eat. And on this particular day in November, the bear was doing just that when out of the corner of his eye, he spotted something strange lying on the forest floor. It was one of the pieces of luggage that the 2 pilots had pushed out of their plane. It was this big, heavy duffel bag. Now, the bear had no idea if this duffel bag contained food, but the bear was optimistic, so it meandered its way over and began pawing at the bag with its massive claws, and pretty much immediately, his claws tore open a hole in this bag. And suddenly, the air all around this bear was filled with this glorious, flowery smell. So the bear put its nose directly into this rip in the bag and began sniffing and licking the contents of this bag. And apparently, the bear just loved it because it ate whatever was inside of the bag, all of it. And when he was done, the bear felt so good, he was so full of energy that he just started sprinting in a straight direction. And after running at top speed about 100 yards, every major system inside of this bear shut down all at once, and he died on the spot, collapsing in that clearing. And then, about 2 weeks later, that hunter walked into the Chattahoochee National Forest and discovered this dead bear. And then, within 24 hours, the hunter was back home, and he told one of his friends about discovering this dead bear. And when he told his friend about seeing this bear, he also kind of casually mentioned that he had seen a duffel bag in the forest not far from this dead bear. Now, to understand what this friend did next, you need some context. By this point in time, the police had actually figured out a lot about that dead man on Fred Myers' driveway, the main pilot of the Cessna. They knew he was a 40-year-old man named Andrew Thornton, who had served in the U.S. Army as a paratrooper, but after getting out of the service, he had kind of gone astray in his life and become a big-time smuggler of illegal goods. The police had also figured out by this point that Andrew, along with a co-pilot, had been the people flying that Cessna that eventually was found crashed into a mountainside in North Carolina. The co-pilot had survived the jump out of the Cessna, and so the police tracked him down, and they very quickly realized this co-pilot was really just a victim of Andrew. Andrew had told this guy they were just going to fly to the Bahamas for a vacation. And so when that plan completely evaporated, and suddenly Andrew is barking orders at this guy to open up the plane and push the luggage out and jump out, the co-pilot said he just totally panicked and just started doing whatever Andrew wanted. And so this guy was just totally terrified, and really all he could offer police was just to confirm that, yup, Andrew was the main pilot, and yes, we really did push his luggage out of the side of the plane over some forest in northern Georgia. The police believed the co-pilot and did not charge him with any crime. The police would go and search all over northern Georgia, and they would find the majority of the missing bags.
However, they knew they were still missing some, and they knew they really needed to recover them. And so, around the time that this hunter is telling his friend about this bear encounter and this duffel bag, the police were constantly having news outlets tell people in northern Georgia that if you see one of these duffel bags attached to a big parachute or something, please come forward and tell us. We are looking for these. And so the hunter's friend thought, you know what? That duffel bag he mentioned out in Chattahoochee National Forest, which is in northern Georgia, might be one of those bags. And so the friend called authorities. Authorities were thrilled to get this tip, and so they charged out to the Chattahoochee National Forest, and they made their way out to where this dead bear was, and then sure enough, about 100 yards away from this bear was this bag, and it was one of the bags they were missing. Except the bag was empty. Because, as we already know, that black bear had eaten everything inside of this bag. And as you might have guessed, that bag, along with every other bag that had been cast out of the Cessna that night, was full of cocaine. Because Andrew was a drug smuggler. And on the night he and his co-pilot leapt from the Cessna, he was trying to smuggle 900 pounds of cocaine from South America into the United States. That transmission that Andrew and the co-pilot suddenly overheard on their radio as they were cruising along in their Cessna was the sound of federal agents within the U.S. Customs and Border Protection Agency who had been tipped off about Andrew's big drug run, and so they really had sent 2 planes to go follow him and potentially intercept him. And so the authorities standing in the Chattahoochee National Forest looking down at this empty duffel bag had no idea where the cocaine went that was supposed to be inside of it. But on a hunch, they decided to bring the body of the dead black bear back with them and perform an autopsy on it. And sure enough, during this autopsy, the medical examiner would open up the bear's stomach, and the examiner would say the stomach was, quote, packed to the brim with cocaine, thus ending the mystery of how this bear died. It died from a massive, massive cocaine overdose. But the bear's story did not end there. Normally, after an animal is autopsied, they are cremated. But for some reason, this medical examiner decided not to do that, and instead, he had the bear taxidermied, and then he gifted this taxidermied bear to the Chattahoochee River National Recreation Area. And then from there, the bear changed hands many times. Over the next 2 decades, no one knows exactly who had the bear and for what reason, but there were reports that at least at one point it was stolen from a storage facility, and then it was sold at a pawn shop, and then at some point the bear was in the possession of famous country singer Waylon Jennings, and then finally the bear found its forever home. Today, the bear is on display at the Kentucky Fun Mall in Lexington, Kentucky, and around its neck is a placard that reads, Cocaine Bear.
Is called My Brother's Keeper. Just after midnight on March 9, 1947, a man slipped out the front door of his 4-story brownstone mansion on New York City's iconic 5th Avenue. The man was named Langley Collier. He was 61 years old, and he was a trained engineer, he was a very famous concert pianist, and he was very wealthy. But he didn't dress like he was wealthy. This night, Langley was going for an 8-mile walk to the south to Brooklyn, New York, where he was going to pick up a very specific thing that he needed for his older brother Homer, who was currently laid up in bed on the 2nd floor of the mansion. It was a freezing cold night, and so as Langley walked along the road, he flipped up his collar of his very shabby wool coat that was held together by safety pins. Nowadays, Langley felt like the only time he was safe going outside was at night, because at nighttime he could kind of hide from the prying eyes of his neighbors, or police officers, or really anyone. It was the one time he could basically be invisible. And so, Langley scurried his way down the dimly lit sidewalk, looking left and right constantly to make sure he wasn't being followed, and then finally at 2 a.m. he arrived at his destination in Brooklyn, a very particular set of dumpsters. And right away, Langley got to work. He went in that dumpster, and he got the things he was looking for, and then put them in his bag, slung it over his shoulder, and then began the long, slow walk back home. Several weeks later, on March 21st, the phone rang inside the police station near where the Collier brothers lived.
And so a sergeant picked up the phone, and on the other line was a guy who called himself Charles Smith, and in a very gruff voice, he told the sergeant that there was a dead body in the Collier brothers' mansion. Now, while of course this was a huge tip, the sergeant was skeptical because the police were aware of the fact that there were lots of rumors floating around about the Collier brothers. They were very eccentric. I mean, Langley's going out at night with a bag over his shoulder and going to look at dumpsters in Brooklyn. I mean, they were also kind of reclusive, and the windows outside of their mansion were boarded up with wood and metal. And so people were kind of on edge about the Collier brothers, and periodically, when they heard rumors about them, they would call the police and report it. And so the police were used to getting these rumor calls, going and checking it out, only to discover that they were not true. And so this sergeant said to Charles Smith, well, how do you know there's a dead body inside the mansion? But the caller simply didn't answer and hung up. And so because the sergeant did not necessarily believe this was a credible tip, instead of sending an entire investigative team to the mansion to check out this dead body, he asked a single police officer to, when he had time, make his way over and basically do a wellness check on the Collier brothers. And so later that day, this one lone police officer showed up to the Collier brothers' mansion. He got out of his cruiser and he just stopped and looked at the brownstone mansion. Even though it was every bit a mansion, it was not in good condition. All the windows were boarded up with wood and metal, and the glass behind them was all shattered. There was newspapers coming out of the broken windows like they had been jammed up against the inside of the windows. There was all this furniture and wooden crates and just junk piled up outside the front of the property. I mean, the place looked kind of dilapidated, and he was shocked that anybody lived in here to begin with. But the Collier family were not normal people. Langley and Homer's dad was a doctor, and he would take home pieces of real people, like parts and organs and that kind of thing, and he would put them in glass jars and put them on display all over the house. Their dad also always canoed to work, which meant walking out of the mansion with a canoe on his shoulder, walking to East River, canoeing his way in his fancy doctor clothes all the way until he got off, and then carrying the canoe to his office building. As for Langley and Homer's mother, she was the first cousin of their dad, and she also kicked their dad out of the house when he tried to convert their entire house into a sanatorium, which is kind of like a cross between a hospital and a resort for people who are recovering from tuberculosis. And so the brothers had grown up in this very odd family, and while they were totally brilliant, they were also very eccentric. Homer, the older brother, was a literal genius who was accepted to study law at the highly prestigious Ivy League University, Columbia, at the age of 14. Langley, who was 5 years younger than Homer, also graduated from Columbia, where he got 2 degrees, one in engineering and one in chemistry. But Langley wasn't just an accomplished scientist, he was also this incredible musician. In fact, he was such a talented pianist that he actually performed shows at New York's legendary Carnegie Hall. But despite their incredible achievements and their huge wealth, Homer and Langley never got married. And over time, after the death of their parents, Homer and Langley became more and more reclusive inside of this mansion. And then in 1933, so 14 years before this lone police officer had arrived at the Collier brothers' mansion to investigate a dead body, Homer Collier had had a stroke and went completely blind. He was only 55 at the time, and really he was at the height of his career, but he was forced to quit his law practice. As for Langley, even though he was very successfully selling pianos and playing these incredible shows at Carnegie Hall, he too had to give up what he was doing and stay home and take care of his brother. And once this happened, the 2 brothers basically stayed in the mansion all the time. They basically never left. And they also stopped paying any of their bills, so their water, their phone, their electricity all got cut off, but instead of the brothers paying the bills to get the power back, Langley just went out and bought a Model T car, and he pulled the engine out of the car and built his own generator. And then when they stopped paying their mortgage, eventually the police came to the mansion to evict them, And when Langley came to the door to speak to the officer, he just wrote a check for the entire amount of the mansion, basically paying for it on the spot. He handed the check to the police officer and then told the officer to leave them alone. And so fast forward back to March 21st, 1947, and this lone police officer, after staring up at this dilapidated mansion, finally walked forward and climbed over all the furniture and junk that was all out front, and he literally climbed his way up the front steps to the front door, where he began pounding on it. But after a while, no one came to the door, and the officer couldn't hear anything inside. Now, because this officer was here to investigate a dead body, no matter how uncredible the claim, the officer knew he really needed to get inside and have a look around. And so he decided he would try to break in the front door. And so after knocking a few more times just to make sure really no one was there, the officer called out and said, "I'm coming in," and then began pounding with his shoulder against the door. And pretty quickly, the door gave way. But it only opened a few inches. And so the officer tried to fit through it, but he was too big, he couldn't fit. But he was able to look into the crack, and he saw there was this huge man-made wall that was basically positioned right inside of the mansion, blocking the front door from opening more than a couple of inches. And so as the officer was thinking about why there would be this wall here, he began to smell this terrible smell coming out of the mansion. And at that point, the officer thought, okay, there could be a dead body in here. I don't know what's going on. And so he called for backup. When backup arrived, the group of officers attempted to smash the front door in together. All 7 of them are ramming against this door, but they could not break down the man-made wall inside. And so ultimately, the police got a ladder and they lined it up on the side of the property, and one of the officers was able to climb up to the second floor, break a window, and climb in that way. And once the police all made their way into the second floor of this mansion, they realized very quickly that the tip Charles Smith had given had been correct. There was a dead body inside of this mansion. It was Homer Collier, the older brother. He was seated in a chair in this alcove on the second floor. He only had on this ragged bathrobe, and he was kind of slouched forward with his head resting on his knee with all these orange peels all around him. The coroner would ultimately determine that Homer likely had been dead for about 10 hours. As for Langley Collier, despite looking around the mansion for him, they couldn't find him. It was like he had just vanished into thin air. And so pretty quickly, the police became suspicious of Langley because they couldn't find him, and they began to think, maybe he had something to do with his brother's death, and that's why he's not here now. In fact, maybe it was Langley who called in the tip as Charles Smith out on the road somewhere after he'd run away. So the police posted an officer at the Collier brothers' mansion. Basically, his job was to stay there in case Langley came back at any time, he could be detained. And then also the police put out a 9-state alarm. Basically all the states around New York were told to keep an eye out for Langley because he was wanted for questioning in connection to his brother's death. And so as police agencies all across the East Coast searched for Langley, largely in vain, detectives in New York continued to search the Collier brothers' mansion to find clues that might shed some light about where Langley went and what role he might have played in Homer's death. And on April 8th, 1947, so 18 days after Homer was first discovered, the police would finally find that big clue that would break the case wide open. Back on March 21st, when that lone police officer first responded to the Collier brothers' house because of this call about the dead body, and then the officer broke the door in and discovered that man-made wall right behind the door, well, that man-made wall was not constructed out of normal building materials like brick or wood or anything else you might expect a wall to be built out of. Instead, it was built out of things like chairs and beds and a sewing machine and all sorts of just junk. It was trash. And this trash wall started right in front of the inside of the front door, and it extended back towards the interior living space of that floor. Except there really wasn't any living space at all anywhere inside of this mansion. Not the second floor, first, third, fourth, nowhere. Because every surface inside of this mansion was covered wall to wall, floor to ceiling in trash. Things like 14 broken pianos, an x-ray machine, there was a horse's jawbone, there were 25,000 books, And, of course, they had all of their father's glass jars that contained all of these human body parts. And over the years, the Collier brothers had apparently begun to think that their neighbors and random passerbys out on the street would someday break into their mansion and steal these treasures from their home. For reference, the Collier brothers did have real treasure in their house. They had tons of cash, they had jewelry, they had real valuables. But to them, that wasn't the real treasure. The real treasure were the things they pulled out of the dumpsters all around the city. And so that was the stuff they were worried about getting stolen from random people outside. And so they had begun fortifying the inside of this mansion to protect themselves when inevitably these people began breaking in. And so basically the inside of their mansion had not just been turned into a big trash pile, but instead they had created all these sophisticated tunnels through all the trash that was everywhere. And lining these tunnels and all these special alleyways they had built were real booby traps. And it was when the police were inspecting one of these tunnels with booby traps in it that they discovered the big clue that broke the case wide open.
A man in his 40s was sitting in a cafe, munching on a ham and cheese sandwich for lunch. Now, usually, the man had more lavish lunches, but today he was in a hurry to get back to work, and this was all the cafe offered. But then, the most wonderful smell filled the air. The man inhaled deeply, enjoying the heavenly aroma of whatever this food was. It smelled like this incredible hot dish. He looked around to see which table the smell was coming from, but as he scanned the restaurant, all he saw were other patrons eating basically simple sandwiches just like him. And then he remembered, this cafe didn't even serve hot meals. But at the same time, he realized he knew that scent from his childhood. It was the smell of the delicious Spanish fried eggs that his mother used to make, called huevos rotos. This was not the man's first phantom smell. A few weeks ago, his apartment had filled with the amazing aroma of his mother's cooking, completely out of nowhere. But now, in this cafe, just like that time in his apartment, the sweet smell suddenly turned sour. The man could taste something metallic in his mouth, and the foul odor of sour milk lingered in the air, making him gag. And so suddenly, a wave of panic crept over the man. He didn't know why he kept smelling things that weren't there. From Ballen Studios and Wondery, I'm MrBallen, and this is MrBallen's Medical Mysteries, where every week we will explore a new, baffling mystery originating from the one place we all can't escape, our own bodies. If you like today's story, ask the follow button to go on a long hike with you, but before you go, superglue a tiny pebble inside one of their shoes. It's common wisdom that diet and exercise are the best ways to maintain your health. As they say, an apple a day keeps the doctor away. But sometimes, no matter how fanatical you are about counting calories and getting daily exercise, there's just nothing you can do to keep certain illnesses at bay. And on this episode, we have two stories about extremely healthy people who find themselves fighting off strange, deadly conditions. The first story is about a marathon runner who suddenly goes through a drastic lifestyle change with no explanation. And the second and final story is about an active older woman who unexpectedly finds herself in the hospital, with doctors struggling to figure out what's wrong with her before it's too late. And now, here's our first story called No Reservations. On a sunny morning in 1993, 42-year-old Roberto Nunez was on his daily run through his hometown of Granada, Spain. And as usual, along this route, he ran past delivery trucks parked outside of restaurants, and kitchen workers carried crates of food from these trucks into the back of the restaurants to prepare for the day's meals. Now, Roberto had never really paid these restaurants much attention. He was an athlete, and to him, food was just fuel, not some delicacy. But that morning, right after passing by the restaurant and smelling the smells of the food, he happened to run past a local bookshop. And for whatever reason, something in that bookshop caught his eye. It was a fine dining cookbook, beautifully displayed in the front window. And for some reason, Roberto stopped his run and just stared at this cookbook. Something about the meal on the cover just looked irresistible. He was so drawn to it, he could almost taste the food in his mouth. Moments later, Roberto found himself inside the bookstore, asking for a copy of that book. As the shopkeeper went to go get a copy of this book, Roberto wandered toward the culinary section of the store and began flipping through the other cookbooks. And by the time the shopkeeper returned, Roberto had a whole pile of them in his arms. When Roberto left the bookshop, he couldn't run anymore because of how heavy all these books were he'd just bought, and so he walked his way home. And then when he got home, he lined up all of his beautiful new cookbooks on his kitchen counter and just stared for a second, marveling at all the food on the covers. Then he went to his refrigerator to grab a container of yogurt, his usual breakfast. But now, as he stared down at the cup of plain, unflavored goop, his tongue seemed to recoil inside of his mouth. He felt like he could almost taste the plastic container and metal spoon before he even took a bite. Suddenly, Roberto's everyday breakfast seemed totally unappealing. And so for the first time in his entire adult life, Roberto decided to take himself out for breakfast. He walked to the nearest open cafe and read their extensive menu, and all the items sounded delicious. Unable to choose, he just asked the server to bring him the most popular dish and one of every side dish on the menu. 20 minutes later, Roberto's little cafe table was so full of plates, he could barely find a spot to set down his espresso mug. Roberto stuck his fork into a potato omelet seasoned with chives and garlic. He took a bite, and it felt like his tongue was exploding with pleasure. He'd had all these foods before, but they had never triggered a response like this. He felt a rush of joy as he leaned over his cafe table and devoured every bit of food his stomach could fit. A few weeks later, Roberto was pacing in his kitchen on the phone, making reservations at one of the most exclusive restaurants in Granada. For the past couple of weeks, he and his wife had been eating out for almost every meal. Roberto didn't know what had come over him. He'd never been a food person, but now he was spending nearly all his time researching the best restaurants in Granada and then making plans to dine at each of them. Meanwhile, his running shoes sat abandoned in his closet. In fact, he hadn't gone running even once this week. Roberto was a marathon runner, but his heart just was not in running anymore. He'd totally stopped counting calories and monitoring his carbohydrate and protein intake. His only long-term goal at the moment was a grand European road trip so he could try all the famous restaurants he'd been reading about. In fact, calling a travel agent was the next item on his to-do list. He intended to eat at every single Michelin-rated restaurant in the entire world. Roberto finalized another restaurant reservation and then hung up, marking the appointment on his calendar, and then he called the next restaurant on his list. 4 years later, Roberto sat at his computer typing up a restaurant review. By this point, his entire life now revolved around food. Every free second was spent eating, planning to eat, or traveling to the best restaurants all over the world so that he could write about them. Roberto looked a lot different now, too. Roberto had really not been running at all over the past few years, and between that and his sedentary lifestyle and new love of gourmet food, he'd gained a good 60 pounds. He'd had to buy a completely new wardrobe, but Roberto didn't mind. He'd actually never had so much fun in his life as he had now, being a foodie. The passion he now felt for food rivaled the sense of accomplishment he used to feel at the end of marathons. It was like he had finally found his real life's purpose. Roberto sat back in his home office chair and closed his eyes, trying to remember the subtlety of a glaze he'd tasted at lunch. He breathed in deeply, then sat up looking around. He breathed in again, and a warm, savory scent filled his nostrils. His entire apartment was suddenly filled with this heavenly aroma, even though he wasn't cooking anything at all. It took him a minute to place this wonderful smell, and then he had it. It was his mother's cooking, a spicy potato dish she used to make him when he was a kid. Confused, Roberto went to the kitchen, wondering if maybe his wife had come home and started making dinner without him noticing, but no, the kitchen was dark and empty. So Roberto wandered the house, running scenarios through his mind that might explain the smell. At first he thought, maybe a window was open and outside smells were coming in. But when that wasn't true, he began to wonder, did somebody break in and were they eating inside of his house? Now he knew that made no sense, but the more he wandered the house, the stronger the smell of his mother's cooking became, but there was no reason for it to be in his apartment. It just made no sense. Roberto was feeling freaked out, especially when, moments later, the smell changed from delicious to sour. He stopped and covered his nose as a chemical-like odor filled the apartment, but even with his nose covered, he could still smell it. Worse, he could taste it on his tongue. He gagged a little, then went to the kitchen to spit in the sink. He flung a window open, trying to air out the smell, and then as quickly as the smell had come on, it disappeared. Roberto stood in his living room feeling very unnerved, trying to tell himself that there had to be some rational explanation here. He told himself that it must have been a neighbor cooking a familiar recipe and accidentally burning it on the stove. But despite his best efforts to convince himself that that really happened, he still felt very unsettled as he went back to his computer to finish his review. A month later, Roberto was at a local cafe enjoying one of his favorite breakfasts, a potato and chorizo omelet with a side of fruit and some bread. He'd just finished slathering the bread with some butter when his nose caught a whiff of that same savory scent he had smelled inside of his apartment. The smell was his mother's cooking, specifically her huevos rotos, a traditional Spanish breakfast she used to make when he was a kid. Roberto looked around, wondering if the smell was coming from a neighboring table, but he was the only one with a plate of food. Roberto picked up his espresso and breathed in deeply, knowing the smell of coffee beans can clear your palate. But when he set the cup down again, that smell was still there. Roberto told himself not to panic, but he was worried. He decided that perhaps it was time to see a doctor about all these phantom smells. A few days later, Roberto was at a neurologist's office explaining how he was smelling all these things that weren't actually there, and he was concerned that he was losing his mind. Now, the neurologist didn't want Roberto to panic, but he did think Roberto might be experiencing smell hallucinations. And they're rare, but very real, and they can be the sign of something dangerous. The doctor explained that smell hallucinations can be caused by head injuries, upper respiratory infections, and in some cases, brain tumors or Parkinson's disease. Roberto did his best to stay calm. He didn't know what he'd been expecting when he got here today, but certainly not being told he could have a brain tumor or Parkinson's disease. The neurologist could clearly read the fear in Roberto's eyes because he immediately told him, don't worry. They'd run some tests and narrow down the possibilities, then figure out what was going on. They'd start by ordering an MRI. Roberto nodded, still feeling very uneasy. And a few hours later, his unease quickly turned to fear as the neurologist showed Roberto his MRI scan and pointed to a long, slender tumor on his right temporal lobe of his brain. Roberto felt petrified as the neurologist explained that the tumor was called a fibroblastic meningioma. It was putting pressure on Roberto's brain and causing him to have these smell hallucinations. The doctor explained that they'd have to surgically remove this tumor. Roberto felt a surge of adrenaline as he imagined himself undergoing brain surgery. He was going to be sick. He bent over, his arms on his knees, trying to catch his breath. And at the same time, the neurologist assured him that they would take very good care of him. The doctor said he would be with Roberto every step of the way. Roberto stood up and nodded. He knew he needed to call his wife and break the terrible news. But then after that, he would call his favorite restaurant to get takeout for dinner. He was in the mood for some comfort food. A few weeks later, Roberto was at home on his couch watching his favorite cooking show on TV. His head was still bandaged from his 14-hour brain surgery, which his neurologist said had been a success, and Roberto had been making slow but steady progress in his recovery. As he flipped through the channels, the mouth-watering smell of roasted chicken suddenly filled the room. And for a second, Roberto was terrified. Was this another smell hallucination? Did the surgery not work? But then he looked up and saw his wife enter the living room carrying 2 plates of roasted chicken, his dinner. His stomach rumbled, and he thanked his wife as she set his plate down on the coffee table and helped him sit upright. Roberto had not had a single smell hallucination since his surgery, and he was hoping that that meant he was cured. And so feeling like he had a new lease on life, Roberto looked forward to getting back to his food blog and the long list of restaurants he still wanted to try. 12 years later, on March 3, 2010, Roberto, who was now 58 years old, stood on the scale at his neurologist's office for a routine follow-up. Even though it had been over a decade since his brain surgery, he still had to get regular MRI scans to make sure there was no new tumors in his brain. The nurse took note of Roberto's weight. By this point, Roberto had gained approximately 110 pounds since he first took an interest in food. But this just didn't really bother him. He knew he'd been gaining weight steadily over the years, because after all, he ate rich and decadent foods for almost every meal, something he just loved to do. And besides, his career in food had really become quite incredible. Roberto was now a widely recognized and respected food critic. He wrote for prestigious magazines and gastronomy guides, and had been featured in a few newspapers. After that day's scan, Roberto waited inside of his neurologist's office expecting the same results he got after every other appointment, all clear and good to go. Except this afternoon, his neurologist did not look too happy when he came through the door. He told Roberto that the MRI today showed a growing lesion and mild damage in the same areas where his tumor had been, and he believed that the lesion was likely left over from his surgery a decade ago. Roberto was shocked and asked the doctor if this meant more brain surgery. But the neurologist assured Roberto that this lesion was small. So small, in fact, they could very likely manage it without having to resort to surgery. Instead, they would do something called radiosurgery, which is when very focused beams of radiation are used to treat cancer cells in other tissue without any incision. Roberto liked the sound of that and scheduled the radiosurgery for later that week. A month later, Roberto parked his car along a street in Granada and adjusted his tie. Then he opened the passenger door for his wife, and the two of them began walking up the sidewalk on their way to a restaurant opening. And as they strolled along the boulevard, Roberto told his wife the good news. He'd had a follow-up doctor's appointment at his neurologist that afternoon. He'd completed his radiosurgery appointments at the start of the month, and now his neurologist told him that his lesion had shrunk by more than 25% and was no longer pressing on his temporal lobe. His neurologist felt optimistic that the lesion would soon be gone, and Roberto would be in full remission. As they neared the restaurant, Roberto's wife gave him a kiss and told him this was fantastic news. She was so relieved. Then the hostess led Roberto and his wife to their table and removed the shiny gold reserved placard as they sat down. The new restaurant was buzzing with anticipation. It was chock full of well-dressed diners, all clearly looking forward to an excellent night of food. A server came out to pour wine, and moments later, Roberto's first course was set down in front of him. But for some reason, it didn't look appetizing. He stared down at the food, trying to conjure some of the excitement he'd been feeling just moments ago, but he couldn't have been less interested. In fact, he kind of just wanted to leave and go home and get a good night's sleep. But Roberto was a professional, so he made himself eat every course they brought out to him. However, later that night, when he was working on the review, Roberto had to admit that his heart just wasn't in it. And so for the first time in more than 15 years, food just didn't really interest him. And the next time Roberto saw his neurologist, he learned why. It would turn out the tumor and lingering lesion pressing on Roberto's temporal lobe, known as the amygdala, was what had caused not only his hallucinatory smells, but his extreme interest in food. The pressure from the tumor created a brain injury, which in very rare cases can trigger a bizarre brain and eating disorder called gourmand syndrome. People who suffer from this condition can literally become completely obsessed with fine dining. They become preoccupied with food and sometimes become compulsive eaters, even if they had formerly been very health conscious. And that's exactly what happened to Roberto. Once Roberto's tumor was removed and the lesion was finally reduced, Roberto's love for food basically completely faded. However, despite that, Roberto did not give up on his career. He kept working as a food critic, even if his job was not nearly as enjoyable as it was before. Hey, it's MrBallen. I'm excited to tell you about something special. For the first time, my show, MrBallen's Medical Mysteries, has joined forces with Redacted, Declassified Mysteries with Luke LaManna, to tell a story so complex it required our combined storytelling styles. This special episode is called A Redacted Medical Mystery. In it, unexplained symptoms after a routine surgery quickly unravel into something much darker, leading straight to classified government operations hidden for decades. To listen and uncover the truth alongside us, head to either the MrBallen's Medical Mysteries or Redacted show pages right now. Or search for A Redacted Medical Mystery in the Wondery app or wherever you get your podcasts. If you're fascinated by unexplained medical stories, well, stick around on Medical Mysteries. Every week, we dive deep into cases that will leave you questioning everything you know about the human body. And if government conspiracies are more your style, Redacted is your go-to for stories that unravel secrets never meant to see the light of day. Remember, you can listen to both shows early and ad-free by joining Wondery Plus. Hey listeners, big news for true crime lovers. You can now enjoy this podcast ad-free on Amazon Music with your Prime membership. Listen to all episodes of my podcasts, MrBallen's Medical Mysteries and MrBallen's Strange, Dark, and Mysterious Stories, along with a huge collection of top true crime podcasts, completely ad-free. No more wading through cliffhangers or dealing with ads, because let's be honest, ads shouldn't be the most nerve-wracking part of true crime. To start your ad-free listening journey, Download the Amazon Music app for free or head to amazon.com/ballen. That's amazon.com/BALLEN. Dive into uninterrupted true crime stories today. And now, here is our second and final story of today's episode, called The Bitter End. One morning in 2022, a 64-year-old woman named Beth shuffled into her kitchen in Ontario, Canada. It was early, and so Beth was still wearing her pajamas. She opened up her kitchen window to let fresh air blow inside, and as she did, she took in a deep breath and smiled. Beth always reminded herself not to take life's small pleasures, like a cool summer breeze, for granted. She grabbed a loaf of whole wheat bread off the counter and put 2 slices in the toaster. Then she opened her fridge and pulled out a container of green juice and a couple of organic eggs. Beth was extremely health and diet conscious and usually had this same breakfast every morning. She drank 2 glasses of juice while her toast cooked, and she scrambled her eggs. Then she sat at the kitchen table to eat. When she finished, she put her dishes in the sink and walked back to her room to get dressed for her morning jog. But as she was trying to decide what shirt to wear, Beth felt this dull pain in her lower abdomen. At first, she was able to ignore it, but then the pain got sharper and Beth suddenly was clutching her stomach. And then she felt weak, and a wave of nausea made her rush from her closet to her bathroom, where she vomited and then had diarrhea. Beth shakily walked to the sink and drank a few sips of water from the tap. When she looked in the mirror, she saw that her face was beet red. She could feel her heartbeat thudding in her throat, and so she brought 2 fingers up to her neck and began to count her pulse. And she found her heart was absolutely racing, and it really scared her because she had high blood pressure, and so she knew, at any point, something could go wrong with her heart. And so suddenly, Beth feared she might be having a heart attack. She stumbled back to her kitchen, she grabbed her landline phone off the counter, and she dialed 911. Less than half an hour later, Dr. Jacob Adams heard a siren blaring as an ambulance pulled up outside of the University of Ottawa's Montfort Hospital. A paramedic hopped out of the back of the vehicle and rushed into the emergency room, shouting to the doctor that, "Hey, we have a patient who's in shock here." And so Dr. Adams immediately ran with the paramedic out towards the ambulance, knowing he had a very sick patient on his hands. Shock occurs when a person doesn't have enough blood circulating throughout their body, and left untreated, it can rapidly lead to organ damage or even death. And this patient, Beth, was already in bad shape. The paramedic said that she was vomiting, she had diarrhea, and her blood pressure was dangerously high. Another paramedic followed closely behind the first, and together, they brought Beth into the emergency room on a gurney. Dr. Adams saw how pale and confused she looked, and knew there was no time to waste. He directed the EMT to wheel Beth into the nearest exam room, while the other paramedic briefed him on Beth's medical history. They told the doctor that Beth had been relatively healthy until today, but she had been taking medications for 2 conditions, high blood pressure and a thyroid deficiency that can leave patients feeling tired and looking pale. Otherwise, she was taking no other drugs. She didn't even take vitamins or over-the-counter supplements. The paramedic said Beth had deteriorated right before their eyes. When they first arrived at Beth's house, she was able to talk to them about her fear that she was maybe having a heart attack. But since then, she had gotten so much sicker that now she could barely talk. Dr. Adams nodded and thanked the paramedics for bringing her in. Then he watched as the ER nurses went to work on their very unstable patient. One nurse checked Beth's temperature, another inserted an IV needle, and a third wrapped a blood pressure monitor around her arm. At first, it showed that Beth's blood pressure was elevated, but suddenly, it plummeted 100 points. Beth's arms went limp, and she looked like she was struggling to breathe. And so within seconds, Beth's blood pressure had gone from being dangerously high to being so low that she could lose consciousness any second. Dr. Adams took one of Beth's hands and squeezed her fingers, making her skin turn white. He waited for the color where he squeezed to come back, but it took an unusually long time. To Dr. Adams, this was extremely worrying. It meant Beth's blood circulation had become dangerously sluggish. Before they could do anything else, Dr. Adams knew he would need to stabilize Beth's condition. He asked a nurse to start her on an IV fluid drip, and almost as soon as the fluids entered Beth's bloodstream, her blood pressure started rising and her breathing returned to normal. After a few minutes, Beth began to speak, albeit in a strained voice, saying that her stomach was killing her. She said she kept getting these horrible, sharp cramps in her lower abdomen, Dr. Adams assured Beth they would figure out what was going on, but they had to perform a lot of different tests as quickly as possible to do that. And so he told her the best thing she could do was try to stay calm and just focus on her breathing. Beth looked scared, but nodded her head in agreement. Then Dr. Adams called in 3 different medical technicians who all surrounded Beth. One of them took vials of her blood, another examined her abdomen with an ultrasound machine, while the third performed an EKG to test her heart function. Meanwhile, Dr. Adams stood off to the side and considered all of his patient's symptoms, and he began to think about a couple of different things that could have caused her to go into shock. Maybe she was having an allergic reaction, or maybe she swallowed some kind of poison, or maybe she was fighting a severe infection. Now, the first two, allergic reaction and poison, were tough to address right now, but the severe infection could be treated right away. So Dr. Adams called for a nurse to start Beth on broad-spectrum antibiotics, hoping this would stop a potential infection in its tracks. While a nurse gave Beth a dose of antibiotics through her IV tube, one of the medical technicians finished taking Beth's blood. Dr. Adams told him to have the blood tested for signs of infection, and also to run an emergency toxicology test to see if there were any traces of poison inside of Beth's body. At almost the same time, the ultrasound technician pulled up black and white images of Beth's digestive system onto a computer screen and told Dr. Adams that they didn't see anything out of the ordinary, like fluid buildup or a bowel obstruction. However, the technician who was doing the EKG had much more ominous news. They said the left side of Beth's heart was working much harder than it should have been, a sign that her heart was not functioning correctly. It could mean that the right side of her heart was failing, and so as a result, the left side was trying to make up for it, which Dr. Adams knew could easily put Beth's life in danger. But, alarming as the EKG results were, they didn't help Dr. Adams determine what was actually causing Beth's intense distress. He needed to get a better understanding of how all of her internal organs were functioning. So he decided to bring her into the radiology department for a CT scan, which would take pictures of the inside of her body. The scan only took about 15 minutes, but it revealed that Beth's problems went beyond her heart. Dr. Adams saw that her small intestine showed signs of inflammation or even a possible obstruction. Though the earlier ultrasound of her abdomen had looked normal, the doctor no longer believed that was accurate. He could tell from the more detailed CT scan that something was wrong after all. And suddenly, Dr. Adams had an alarming thought. Maybe Beth was bleeding internally inside of her digestive system. Severe internal bleeding could explain a lot of Beth's symptoms, including nausea, vomiting, diarrhea, and her sudden drop in blood pressure. But this would be a terrifying diagnosis. If Dr. Adams didn't locate and stop the bleeding right away, Beth could bleed to death. A few minutes later, Dr. Adams received the results of Beth's blood work. Her toxicology report came back normal, meaning technicians had not found any poison in her system, but on the other hand, the results showed she did have elevated levels of a protein found in red blood cells, which did seem to indicate she did have internal bleeding. And just as the doctor set her test results aside, Beth's blood pressure suddenly plummeted again. She went pale and her breathing became labored. Dr. Adams looked up and noticed her IV fluid bag was empty, so he quickly replaced it with a full one, and as soon as the fluids flowed into her system, just like the last time, her blood pressure immediately stabilized. But to Dr. Adams, this was not a good sign. If Beth was rapidly bleeding internally, IV fluids would keep her going for a while, but eventually it would not be enough, and so she needed a blood transfusion as quickly as possible. And at this point, Beth looked sicker than ever. She groaned in pain and then leaned over the side of her hospital bed and vomited up blood. Now, Dr. Adams was certain that she was bleeding internally into her stomach, which was why she was throwing up the blood. He immediately called in a nurse, who began giving Beth a blood transfusion. He also continued giving her IV fluids and started her on drugs that would keep her blood pressure up and reduce acid in the stomach to hopefully slow the bleeding. After all that, Dr. Adams transferred Beth to the intensive care unit, where they met with a gastrointestinal specialist named Dr. Christina King. Dr. King said she needed to insert a tiny camera down Beth's throat and into her abdomen. That way, she could see firsthand where the blood was coming from. Dr. King turned to Beth, whose face was scrunched up in pain, and explained the procedure. Beth would be put under light anesthesia for about 30 minutes, and during that time, Dr. King would insert a tube with the camera on one end into Beth's esophagus and down into her stomach. Beth looked uneasy, but she was so sick that a tube going down her throat seemed like a small price to pay for some answers. She said okay, and the doctors got to work prepping her for the procedure. About 15 minutes later, Beth had been put under anesthesia and was lying on her side on a bed in her ICU room. Dr. King stood beside her and carefully inserted the long, thin tube down her throat. Dr. King could see the inside of Beth's esophagus on a screen right beside her bed. Dr. King moved the tube further down Beth's digestive system, and as soon as the camera entered Beth's stomach, Dr. King saw that her stomach lining was swollen, red, and bleeding. The bleeding was not severe, but the doctor knew that was only thanks to the drugs that Dr. Adams had given Beth. Later that afternoon, Dr. King sat in the ICU with Beth, who was still sedated from her procedure. Beth did look much better than she had just a few hours ago, and Dr. King was glad that the treatment she and Dr. Adams had come up with seemed to be working. Her internal bleeding had largely stopped, at least for now, and so for the time being, Dr. King could really focus on why Beth was bleeding internally. Dr. King was starting to think that Beth's illness had been caused by something that she might have eaten, rather than by poison or an infection. And so once Beth woke up from her procedure, Dr. King asked her if she'd eaten anything out of the ordinary that morning before she'd gotten sick. Beth initially said no. She'd had the same breakfast she ate every single morning: whole wheat toast, organic eggs, and homemade green juice. However, Beth said, now that she thought about it, her juice had tasted a bit more bitter than usual. Dr. King asked what kind of juice it was, and Beth said, she made it herself from a type of green squash called bottle gourds that she had bought at the store. She'd heard that bottle gourds were a really great health food, and so for the last several years, she'd been pureeing the vegetables into a juice that she would drink every morning. Dr. King just stared at Beth, because suddenly she knew what was going on with Beth, and it made perfect sense. Beth had given herself a nearly fatal case of toxic squash syndrome. It's a very rare condition that results from eating poisonous chemicals sometimes found in squashes and gourds. These toxins are called cucurbitacins, and they taste very bitter. Over hundreds of years, people have bred squashes to have only trace levels of these toxins. But sometimes the plants can still develop high amounts of cucurbitacins as they grow, and people who eat a lot of those types of vegetables can get dangerously ill. Beth went to her local grocery store and unknowingly bought bottle gourds that did contain a dangerous amount of these toxins. Then she pureed the vegetables and drank the juice, and the only thing she noticed was a slightly bitter taste, until just minutes after breakfast, the toxins caused her stomach lining to start bleeding, and Beth went into shock. Her case was the first of its kind ever reported in Canada. After 5 days in the ICU, Beth was finally healthy enough to return home. 2 weeks later, her doctors called to check on her condition, and she told them that she was feeling fine, except for one symptom. In the past few days, her hair had begun falling out. Her doctors told her that this was actually normal. Delayed onset hair loss had been reported in a number of cases of toxic squash syndrome. Despite her hair loss, which was actually only temporary, Beth would go on to make a full recovery and go back to her normal life, though she found another kind of juice to drink at breakfast. On the afternoon of October 16, 1991, a 36-year-old man named Enrique Martinez bent down, pulled out his pocket knife, and he carefully cut through the stem of a mushroom that was growing right next to a mossy log. And then after freeing this mushroom, he put it inside of his wicker basket with the other mushrooms he had collected in the area, and then Enrique stood up and just took a minute to take in the unbelievable view of this lush green valley right below him. Enrique was out mushroom hunting along with his wife Anna and their two friends, Jorge and Sofia, who were dating. And where they were mushroom hunting was near this old abandoned town called La Musara, which is located up in the mountains of northeastern Spain. It had been Jorge's idea to come to this area and explore. Jorge had heard all these crazy stories about La Musara, about how it was haunted, and there was all this creepy folklore surrounding this town. As for Enrique, he didn't really care about the lore surrounding this town. Frankly, the town was not that interesting to him. What was interesting was the opportunity to come out here and collect mushrooms. That was something he really liked to do. Enrique and his wife Anna lived in this very busy port city in Spain called Tarragona, and so their lives day to day were very hectic. Enrique, he worked at a bar as a bartender, and so every night he was surrounded by hundreds of people coming in and out. And so having a chance to come out here and be in nature at peace and collect these mushrooms just sounded too good to turn up. Enrique stopped staring at the valley right in front of him, and he turned around and continued to scan the mountainside for a particular type of mushroom that grew in this area. It was called the bloody milk cap, which was known to be great for grilling. It paired well with meat. And so Enrique's plan was to go out on this mushroom hunting trip, and when they got back, he wanted to cook a feast using these mushrooms for his wife and his friends. The group slowly made their way uphill until they finally saw the outskirts of the abandoned town, La Musara. La Musara was more than 900 years old, and now it was just a collection of crumbling ruins, some dating back to prehistoric times. La Musara had never been a big town. At its peak, it had about 300 residents. But the last of the remaining residents of this town had finally fled 40 years earlier, and so now it was a ghost town. The group made their way over to one of the buildings that was right on the outer perimeter of La Musara. It was basically just a foundation with 3 walls still standing. There was no roof, but the friends, they went over to this building, and from right next to it, they were able to look straight down the main drag of La Musara. It was basically just a dirt road that went straight out, and all along the road were other kind of ruined foundations of where buildings used to be. And fairly far down this road, maybe 200 feet away from where all the friends were standing, was the center of La Musara, which was marked by this big church with a huge steeple, and the church was actually in decent shape. It had not totally crumbled onto itself like the rest of the buildings around it. And then behind the church, somewhat visible from where the friends were standing, was this overgrown cemetery. And then kind of off to the side of the church was this pond that was also very overgrown, and it was full of croaking frogs. Enrique and his friends just stood there next to their dilapidated building, staring at La Musara in silence. Now, they knew this place was going to be very creepy. People had said it was haunted, and that was a big reason why Jorge wanted to come here. But now seeing it in person, really the creep factor was much higher than they expected. It really did look like a spooky place. And then adding to the spook factor was very clearly, as they were looking down this main road, the friends could see this mist kind of starting to envelop the town. Jorge had told the friends when he was doing his research about La Musara that the mist was really a trademark of this town. That at night, it basically got completely consumed in white mist. But now the friends are looking down this road, it's the middle of the day, and already the mist is starting to come in. Finally, Jorge broke the silence and said, "Hey, I want to show you guys something." And he grabbed his girlfriend Sophia's hand, and he began kind of jogging down the main road in the direction of the church. And so Enrique and Anna followed behind. And after only walking maybe 10 or 20 feet, Enrique happened to turn around and look back where they had just been standing next to this dilapidated building, and already he couldn't see that building because this fog had rolled in and totally obscured his view. Enrique couldn't help but feel a little uneasy, again, because he thought the fog was supposed to come in at night, and it's broad daylight, and here we are, totally covered in fog, but he shook it off, thinking, what's the big deal? And so Enrique turned back around, and he and Anna hustled to catch up with Jorge and Sofia, who by this point had stopped a little farther down the road, off to the side, where there was this strange rectangular rock that was maybe 2 feet tall, just kind of jutting up out of the ground. And when Enrique and Anna made it to Jorge and Sofia, Jorge placed his hand on the top of this strange rock, and looking very satisfied with himself, he would tell his friends, "This is the Sis Stone, and people say it contains dark powers." The Sis Stone was actually one of the oldest things in all of La Musara. Back in the day, Muslim armies used to march through La Musara, which actually got its name from this. La Musara means the place to march. And so these armies, as they would pass through La Musara, making their way to the valley down below, they would always stop at the Sis Stone because they believed it had magical powers that could help them defeat their enemies in their upcoming battles. Now, the Muslim armies were long gone by this point, but the Sis Stone was still there, and people still said that it contained that kind of magical power, that there were dark forces at work inside of the stone
And so to touch it was very risky. In fact, some people said if you touched the cyst stone, you could be sucked into this parallel world full of all these demonic entities. And so as Jorge told the group about all this history surrounding the cyst stone and how no one should touch it, remember, he's got his hand squarely on the cyst stone the whole time. And so when he finishes telling the story, he looks at the others and said, "Come on, somebody else touch it." Jorge's girlfriend, Sophia, said, "Absolutely not. I'm not about to tempt evil spirits here." But Enrique's wife, Anna, said, "You know what? I'll touch it." And so Jorge smiled, he pulled his hand off the cyst stone, and Anna, she walked forward, she took a deep breath, and then she placed her hand on the stone. And for a second, the whole group just held their breath, like something was going to reach out and grab Anna and pull her into the stone, but nothing happened, and a minute later, Anna had pulled her hand off, and the whole group was laughing. But just a couple of seconds later, Enrique, who had been laughing along with the group, suddenly noticed that the frogs in the pond near the church, a little farther down the road from where they were suddenly so much louder. It was almost like when they touched the stone, it had maximized the volume of these frogs. And so Enrique, he turned his whole body and began staring down the road through the mist and fog at this pond, and he could kind of barely make it out. You know, he was trying to see if there was something obvious causing these frogs to kind of go crazy. But as he stared at this pond, which again, he could barely see, right behind it was the church. But there was lots of fog kind of blocking the church. And for a second, the fog kind of parted, and Enrique got a full shot of one of the windows of this abandoned church. And in the window was this dark figure just standing there staring at Enrique and his friends. And Enrique, he sees this thing in the window, and in a second, it was gone. And then the fog rolled back in, covered up the window, and Enrique couldn't see anything anymore. And so Enrique just stood there in stunned silence, having no idea if what he just saw had really just happened or if it was in his imagination or something. But before he could even try to process what had just happened, he heard his name being called. And so he kind of snapped out of it and he turned back to the group, and it was Anna who was now jokingly saying, "Come on, Enrique, touch the stone too." Enrique quickly scanned Anna, Sophia, and Jorge's face, and they were all smiling and laughing still, and so clearly none of them had seen this figure in the window. And so Enrique, he kind of just looked at all of his friends, and then he looked back in the direction of the church and this window, which again he couldn't see because the fog was blocking it out. And so Enrique just tells himself, okay, there's no way that I just saw some dark figure moving around this abandoned church. You know, that must have been my imagination. I'm totally fine. And so he turned back to his friends, and he could tell they were not going to let it go until he touched the stone. And so he said, fine, and he walked up and he touched the stone. And immediately, as soon as his hand made contact with that stone, everything seemed to change. The air around Enrique got cooler, and the stone itself started to warm up. And as this happened, Enrique, whose hand was still on the stone, began to think, wow, I could do this for hours. I could just stay here and leave my hand on the stone. I mean, this is amazing. But then somewhere buried deep in his mind, Enrique began telling himself, get away from the stone. Take your hand away. Get away right now. And so finally, Enrique did yank his hand away, and right away, all those feelings he was having as he touched the stone disappeared. The air went back to normal. He did not feel compelled to touch the stone, and he just kind of was left thinking, what just happened?
Hey listeners, big news for true crime lovers. You can now enjoy this podcast ad-free on Amazon Music with your Prime membership. Listen to all episodes of my podcasts, MrBallen's Medical Mysteries and MrBallen's Strange, Dark, and Mysterious Stories, along with a huge collection of top true crime podcasts, completely ad-free. No more wading through cliffhangers or dealing with ads, because let's be honest, ads shouldn't be the most nerve-wracking part of true crime. To start your ad-free listening journey, download the Amazon Music app for free, or head to amazon.com/ballen. That's amazon.com/BALLEN. Dive into uninterrupted true crime stories today. Hey, it's Mr. Ballen. For the first time, my show, Medical Mysteries, has joined forces with Redacted for a special episode. A redacted medical mystery uncovers how routine surgery leads to classified government operations. Listen now on the Medical Mysteries or Redacted feeds, or search A Redacted Medical Mystery wherever you get your podcasts. And so Enrique's wife, Anna, along with Jorge, they were both grinning at Enrique, waiting for him to tell them about what it was like to touch the cyst stone. But behind them, Sophia, Jorge's girlfriend, she was not happy. She was the only one who had not touched the cyst stone. And so she spoke up and said, guys, let's get away from the cyst stone. I don't want to continue to tempt evil spirits, okay? Let's just go. And so Jorge threw his arm around Sophia and told her to lighten up, and then said, come on, let's do some more exploring. And so Jorge took Sophia's hand, and he continued walking down the main road in the direction of the church, and Enrique's wife, Anna, she quickly followed right after them, kind of running to keep up, like she was a kid who was excited about what they were doing. But Enrique, he just stayed put for an extra second, because even though he had told himself that, whatever he saw in the window was nothing, he could not help the fact that as soon as he touched that cyst stone, he felt different. There was something off about this stone, and really there seemed to be something off about this whole village, which by this point was now completely enveloped in fog. They were totally covered. Now, Enrique, at this point, did just want to leave La Musara. He didn't want to be there anymore. The place was totally creeping him out. But he didn't want to be a party pooper, and so he turned and continued walking down the main road after his friends and his wife. And after he walked a little ways, the fog parted enough that he could see the pond full of these very loud croaking frogs, as well as the church and that window where he had seen or supposedly seen this dark figure, but the window was empty. And Enrique was relieved to see that his friends clearly had not stopped at the church. They had not tried to go in. They had gone behind the church into the cemetery. Enrique did not want to go inside of the church because even though, again, he had told himself that, that figure wasn't real, it wasn't really in the window, still there was a part of him that wanted to stay far away from this building. But after Enrique walked past the pond and began side-skirting the church to get to the cemetery, he just stopped and turned and actually faced the window, kind of like involuntarily. He was looking at the window where this dark figure had been. And again, it's empty, there's nothing there. But Enrique felt like something was pulling him towards this window. And so without saying anything to his friends, who aren't really paying attention to Enrique, they're kind of just walking around the cemetery, Enrique walked right up to this window. He's right in front of it, he's looking inside, and now he can see into the actual church. And it's totally ruined inside, but he can see where the pews used to be on the ground, and he could also see where the pulpit used to be, where the priest would give mass. And as Enrique stood there staring into the church, he kept leaning closer and closer and closer into the church until finally he felt like he really wanted to move away and get away from the church, but it was like he couldn't. He just kept getting pulled into this opening. And then as this was happening, the sound of the frogs got louder and louder until Enrique felt like he was totally consumed by these frogs. Meanwhile, just around the corner of the church and back in the cemetery, Anna, Jorge, and Sophia were kind of laughing and walking around the cemetery, reading the different headstones, when at some point, Anna, Enrique's wife, just happened to look up when she realized Enrique was not there with them. And so Anna, she walked over to the gate of the cemetery and she looked up along the side of the church, and there was Enrique kind of leaning forward into this window looking into the church. And so Anna, she yelled out to him a couple of times, but Enrique did not even notice her or acknowledge her. He just continued leaning forward, looking in this window. And finally, Anna got right up next to Enrique and she actually shook his shoulder. And when she did that, Enrique kind of snapped out of it and turned and looked at her, but didn't say anything. He just had this totally confused look on his face. And Anna, she looks up at her husband and she's like, come on, come into the cemetery. That's where everyone is. Come on. And then Anna turned and skipped towards the cemetery. And once Anna was back in the cemetery, she just got right back to walking around and looking at all the different headstones. And at some point, as she was looking at one particular headstone, she took a few steps back to get a better look at it, and she accidentally bumped into another headstone, a big cross that had a line drawn across it, and it fell to the ground and it broke. Jorge and Sophia heard the sound of the stone breaking in half, and they turned and looked at Anna, and they kind of quickly understood what had happened. And Jorge, he just started laughing at her, and he said, oh boy, now you've upset the evil spirits in this town. You better put that back together. Now, Anna was trying to make light of this, but she was totally panicking and did not like the fact that she had just desecrated a gravesite in a potentially haunted town. And so she began picking up the headstone and trying to put the stone back on top, but it was no use. It was totally broken.
And so as Anna continued to fumble with this headstone, and as Jorge continued to laugh and harass her about all the evil spirits that were going to attack her because of what she did, Jorge's girlfriend, Sophia, who was right next to him, she started getting on edge, and she said, "Hey, Jorge, is it true that this place is haunted? I mean, really, is this actually a haunted town? I mean, what's the deal?" And Jorge, at this point, he stops laughing at Anna, and he turns to Sophia, and he goes, "Yeah, I think this place really is haunted." And then he would tell them the story of how La Musara came to be known as a haunted town. Back in October of 1873, there was a civil war happening in this part of Spain. And one of the rival armies was using the caves in the mountainside kind of near La Musara as sort of makeshift field hospitals for their wounded. And one night, a very famous general named Cercos was wounded in battle. He was brought into one of these caves, and that was where he died. Now, Cercos was a beloved leader, and so the people inside of this cave really wanted to give him a proper burial, but they knew they had to keep his death a secret. Because if it got out to the rest of the men that their leader had died, it would be totally demoralizing, and it would really give their enemies a victory. And so the 6 people inside of this cave, they built a coffin and placed Cercos inside of it. And then early the next morning, when it was still dark out, these 6 carried the coffin with Cercos inside of it up into La Musara, and they buried him secretly in the cemetery behind the church. Weeks later, 5 armed rival soldiers climbed up the mountain into La Musara to look for General Cercos. They didn't know that he had died in that battle. In fact, really, besides those 6 people that saw him die and secretly buried him, nobody knew he was dead. And so these soldiers actually thought Cercos was hiding out in La Musara. And so these soldiers began busting into all the civilians' homes in La Musara and ripping them apart, looking for this general, and they'd send the people out into the streets and tell them they're going to kill them unless they give up information about where this general is. And finally, after about an hour of this, an elderly man who lived in La Musara had just had enough, and he stepped forward and he told the rival soldiers that General Cercos was dead, that he was buried in the cemetery behind their church. But the rival soldiers didn't believe the man. They said, "Okay, show us proof." But the elderly man said, "Well, I don't know exactly where he was buried in the cemetery. I just heard that's where he was buried." And so the soldier said, "Okay, get everybody over to the cemetery right now." And so all the townspeople made their way over to the cemetery, and the soldiers followed them. And then once they were there, the soldiers demanded that the townspeople begin basically digging up all the graves to find Cercos. And as the townspeople began to dig, the sound of the frogs in the nearby pond began to get louder and louder and louder, until finally the leader of these rival soldiers actually stepped away from all the chaos happening in the cemetery and walked over to the pond and began firing his gun into the water to get the frogs to stop. But they wouldn't. They actually only got louder and louder. And so the leader of these rival soldiers finally just gives up on trying to quiet down these frogs, and he turns around and walks back into the cemetery, and he finds all the townspeople have stopped digging. They've basically dug up every grave, and they haven't found Cercos, and they're just kind of waiting to see what happens next. But the leader, as he looked across this graveyard, he noticed there was one grave that very conspicuously had not been touched. Everything around it had been dug up, but not this. No one had touched that grave. And so the leader said, "Go, dig that one up." But immediately the townspeople kind of took a step back and acted like, "No way, we're not going near that grave." And so finally, a townsperson actually stepped forward and said to the leader of these rival soldiers that that grave contained this old woman who had died recently, who everyone suspected of being a witch. And so it was dangerous to try to dig her up. But the rival soldiers did not care at all about this. They just raised their guns and demanded the townspeople dig that grave up immediately. And so they would. They would go over, they would unearth this coffin, and then the rival soldiers would pop open the lid. And as soon as it was open, everybody went silent. Because this woman, who had died weeks earlier, looked totally preserved. She was laying on her back, and her skin was very pale, but it had not begun to rot yet. Even her cheeks still had a kind of pinkish hue to them, and her lips were open partway, as if she had been buried mid-sentence. But what really had startled the group into silence was this woman's eyes were wide open when they opened up this coffin. It looked like she was looking directly at all of them. And so after a couple of seconds of the silence from seeing this woman for the first time, the townspeople began to cry and scream and back up away from this coffin. And the rival soldiers, they were startled too by this woman's appearance, but they were more angry than anything else, because by finding this woman in this grave, it meant they had not found the general. And so out of frustration, the rival soldiers grabbed this old woman's body, this witch's body, and they pulled her out of her grave, they strung her up to a tree, and they just sat there shooting at her constantly until her body had basically been obliterated by all the bullets. And then finally, when the soldiers stopped shooting, they realized everything had gone quiet. Just a second earlier, the cacophony of these frogs croaking in the pond that had been so loud it was like totally overwhelming had now completely ceased, and it was like the town had gone absolutely still. And this stillness and quietness was so unsettling for these soldiers that they actually just turned and fled right there without saying a word to the townspeople. And then once the soldiers were all gone, the townspeople got to work reburying their dead. And at some point, one of the townspeople jumped into the grave where the witch had been, and when they landed in the dirt at the bottom, their foot actually sunk down an extra foot. They had landed on something hollow and crashed into it. And what it was another coffin. There was another coffin buried below this woman's that the soldiers had not seen. And this secret coffin belonged to General Serkos. When those 6 people had secretly buried General Serkos, they had just placed his coffin at the bottom of an open grave that was about to be filled with somebody else's coffin. They put it in, they covered up his coffin with enough dirt that no one could see it, and then the next day, the townspeople lowered the witch in her coffin into that grave without realizing General Serkos was below it, and then they filled it in, and then they placed a headstone on her grave, but because they thought she was a witch, they decided not to write her name on the headstone. Instead, they just etched a horizontal line across her headstone. And so after this incident with the rival soldiers desecrating this woman's grave and her body, La Musara was never the same. People in the town began dying left and right, and their soil went bad, so they couldn't plant any crops, and then all these insects came through the town, and then all these plagues of illnesses and diseases came through. And so it wasn't long before La Musara had developed this reputation of being cursed. And by the 1950s, that curse apparently had driven the last few people out, officially making it a ghost town.
Hey listeners, MrBallen here. What if I told you that some of the strangest, darkest, and most mysterious stories happening right now are all connected to what might be the biggest crime of our generation? You know I'm always on the hunt for the most chilling and perplexing tales out there. Well, I've discovered a new podcast that uncovers real-world mysteries unfolding right now, much like how another Ballen Studios podcast, Redacted Declassified Mysteries, brings hidden government secrets to light. And it's called Lawless Planet. Host Zach Goldbaum reveals how shocking tales of murder, cover-ups, and mysterious deaths are all part of something bigger: the systematic destruction of our planet. From activists who vanish in the Amazon to whistleblowers uncovering billion-dollar environmental crimes, these aren't just stories about the environment. They're real-life thrillers about people caught between powerful forces willing to kill to keep their secrets buried. Follow Lawless Planet on the Wondery app or wherever you get your podcasts. You can listen to new episodes of Lawless Planet early and ad-free right now by joining Wondery Plus. Hey, it's MrBallen. I'm excited to tell you about something special. For the first time, my show, MrBallen's Medical Mysteries, has joined forces with Redacted, Declassified Mysteries with Luke Lamanna, to tell a story so complex it required our combined storytelling styles. This special episode is called A Redacted Medical Mystery. In it, unexplained symptoms after a routine surgery quickly unravel into something much darker, leading straight to classified government operations hidden for decades. To listen and uncover the truth alongside us, head to either the MrBallen's Medical Mysteries or Redacted show pages right now. Or search for A Redacted Medical Mystery in the Wondery app or wherever you get your podcasts. If you're fascinated by unexplained medical stories, well, stick around on Medical Mysteries. Every week, we dive deep into cases that will leave you questioning everything you know about the human body. And if government conspiracies are more your style, Redacted is your go-to for stories that unravel secrets never meant to see the light of day. Remember, you can listen to both shows early and ad-free by joining Wondery Plus.
After Jorge wrapped up the story, Anna was just horrified looking straight down at the ground, because it would turn out the gravestone that she had accidentally knocked over and broken, well, it had a horizontal line etched across the middle of it. It was the witch's headstone. That was the one she had broken. And so suddenly feeling totally spooked, Anna was about to yell to Jorge and Sofia that she wants to leave now, when she happened to glance over at the base of one of the cemetery walls, and she saw the perfect bloody milk cap mushroom, the exact type she knew her husband was looking for. And so Anna walked over, she picked this mushroom, and she turned around to show it to Enrique, but Enrique was not in the cemetery. And so right away, Anna thought, wait, did my husband ever actually follow me back down into the cemetery after I saw him by the church? She couldn't remember. She thought he followed her, but she wasn't sure. And so Anna yelled out for Enrique, but he never called back. And so she turned and looked over at Sofia and Jorge, who she could barely see through the fog, and she asked them, hey, have you seen my husband? Is he in here? Did you see where he went? And they both said, no, we have no idea. And so Anna, who at this point was now really starting to panic, because this whole situation in La Musara was getting pretty spooky for her, and so she just dropped the mushroom and took off running out of the cemetery. Now, Sofia and Jorge did not really know what was going on. They didn't understand the urgency that Anna was feeling to find Enrique, and so they saw her take off to go find Enrique, and they just kind of casually walked on after her. And when they turned the corner and they exited the cemetery and began walking basically alongside the church, now again, the visibility is terrible from all this fog, as they moved along, they couldn't see Anna or Enrique, but they could hear Anna calling out for Enrique over and over again. And as they moved, Sofia and Jorge, they would see these shadows moving around in the fog. And they would think it was Enrique or Anna, but as they got up to where these shadows were, there'd be nothing there. And so Sofia, she began grabbing tighter and tighter onto Jorge's arm, and Jorge, who had been kind of joking about how this place was evil, was also now starting to feel a little bit spooked about what was going on. And so they began walking a little bit faster and faster in the direction of Anna's voice. And as Sofia and Jorge got closer and closer to Anna, the sound of the frogs in that pond began to get louder and louder and louder until Jorge and Sofia could barely hear Anna over the sound of these frogs. And then just like that, the frogs stopped. And all Sofia and Jorge could hear was the sound now of Anna crying. Now, Jorge and Sofia could not actually see Anna because of the fog, but they walked in the direction of her voice, and they ultimately found Anna crouched down with her back to them right in the spot where Enrique had previously been standing staring in that church window. And so Sofia and Jorge, they walked up to Anna and they reached down and they put their hands on her shoulder. And when Anna turned around, she was clutching Enrique's wicker basket containing all of his mushrooms. And with tears coming down Anna's eyes, she would say to her friends, "He's gone." Anna, Jorge, and Sofia would spend the next hour searching in vain for Enrique in La Musara. Remember, there's no visibility from the fog, and now it's getting dark, and so it's really hard to conduct a search for someone. And so after this hour was up, even though they had no idea where Enrique was or what happened to him, the friends decided that their best and really only move was to leave and go tell authorities. And when they did that, a massive search was launched all around La Musara for the next week. But despite this huge effort, nobody ever found any trace of Enrique. He just vanished, leaving behind that wicker basket that Anna had found. And so after this week of searching, the authorities finally called it off and told Anna that, most likely her husband must have wandered off and died somewhere, and at some point, hikers will likely discover his body. But Anna could not accept this conclusion, and so she continued to go back to La Musara to look for Enrique. And in January of 1992, so 3 months after Enrique had gone missing, Anna, Sofia, and Jorge returned to La Musara to do another one of these additional searches. And during the search, the the friends were walking past the church and they passed by that same window where Enrique had been standing looking inside and also where his basket had been found by Anna. And the three friends, as they passed by, they happened to see into the church, and down on the main floor where the pews used to be and where the pulpit used to be, there were these 6 dark figures wearing robes standing in a circle, not appearing to be doing anything but just standing there. And immediately, Anna actually was really annoyed, because she figured this must be a group of ghost hunters that were out here looking for something paranormal, because after Enrique went missing, his story made the news largely because he went missing in a town that's long been regarded as being haunted. And so because of his case, you had all these people coming to La Musara to go find ghosts or find whatever happened to Enrique. And so Anna, who was deeply offended by all these people who were coming out to La Musara to look for ghosts, because for Anna, this is not a game. Her husband really went missing here. So she goes right up to the window to tell these 6 people in robes off, get the hell out of here and have some respect. But when she went to the window and was about to yell in, one of the robed figures suddenly turned and looked up at Anna. And immediately Anna backed up because this clearly was not some ghost hunter. Because the hooded figure had no face. It was just a dark hole looking back up at Anna. But even though there were no eyes, Anna could tell this thing, this entity, was staring right at her. But before Anna, Sofia, or Jorge could react to what they were seeing inside of this church, from behind them, they suddenly heard this unbelievably loud galloping sound, like all these horses were charging towards them. And at the same time, the sound of the frogs in the nearby pond began to get louder and louder and louder. And so Anna, Sofia, and Jorge turned around to see what was going on, kind of expecting to see, a cavalry approaching or something. But there was nothing. All they saw was the fog on the road. And so the 3 friends turned back around to look back into the church. And now these 6 hooded figures were gone. And so suddenly thinking that these figures had left the church and they were coming to get them, the 3 friends did not wait any longer. They turned and just sprinted out of La Musara. Enrique was never found. His wife, his friends, the authorities, they still have no idea what happened to him. There have also been several other people who have gone missing in La Musara, and they too have never been found. Based on that big clue, here is the leading theory about what happened to Homer and Langley Collier. Back on March 9th, 1947, so the night that Langley had snuck out the front door in the middle of the night with his shabby clothes on and headed to Brooklyn where he went dumpster diving, well, he wasn't just dumpster diving to find new treasures to bring back to the mansion to stuff inside. Instead, he was actually looking for something really specific for his brother. He was looking for oranges, like the fruit. And this particular dumpster in Brooklyn was right behind a store that sold fruit, and so there were always lots of oranges in this dumpster. Langley was actually trying his very best to take care of his older brother Homer. He had actually begun doing research using his father's old medical textbooks to try to find a cure for Homer's blindness caused by his stroke. And at some point, Langley believed he really had come across the cure. And the cure was basically for Homer to eat oranges. Lots and lots of oranges. And in fact, over the last several weeks before this night, Langley had already made this change in Homer's diet. He only fed him oranges for every single meal. He got them from this dumpster, and he fed them to Homer. And Homer, he too believed this cure was going to work, and so he ate the oranges without question. And so back on March 9th, after Langley had gathered up the oranges from inside this dumpster, slung it on his shoulder, and walked back to his mansion, he maneuvered his way through the crack in the front door because he was super skinny. He was able to barely get through. And then once he was inside the mansion and shut the door behind him, he maneuvered his way up to the second floor. And then he began the most dangerous part of his journey from one side of the second floor to the other where Homer was. Basically, Langley needed to crawl through a 2-foot wide tunnel he had built through all the junk and trash, but it was lined with booby traps. In particular, there was a nasty trap at the end of the tunnel where there was this stack of metal boxes filled with all these newspapers. They were really heavy, and they were positioned so if you even so much as barely touched the lowest box, they would come crashing down on you. Now, Langley had made this journey countless times. This is how he went to see his brother every single day as he went through this tunnel. But on this day, as he low-crawled his way through the tight tunnel in the trash, he accidentally knocked the lowest metal box. The boxes tumbled down on him and pinned him to the ground. Now, these boxes were very heavy, but they were not heavy enough to kill someone. It would just pin them down. It would be impossible to get out from under them. And so Langley, very likely, after getting trapped, called out for his brother, Homer, who was actually only 10 feet away from him. But Homer was blind, he was sick, he had absolutely no energy because all he ate was oranges and it was basically killing him. And so he couldn't even get out of his chair, let alone go save his brother. And so for several agonizing hours, Langley likely yelled for his brother until the weight of all these boxes did crush him to death. And then Homer was left all alone in this house where no one knew he needed help and no one could even get to him if they wanted to. And so he was doomed. And so for 2 weeks, Homer just sat in this chair, starving to death, while he likely listened to the sound of rats eating his brother's body. The big clue that the police found that broke this case wide open is they actually spotted Langley's white foot bone that had been picked clean by the rats jutting up out of this trash tunnel 10 feet away from Homer. When the police had first searched the mansion, it was so full of stuff that they never saw this bone. It just kind of blended in. But 18 days after finding Homer, they realized Langley was right there. There was a skeleton. As for the Charles Smith tipster that police thought had to be Langley calling in after he had murdered his brother, well, it wasn't Langley because Langley was dead at the time this tip came in. And so Charles Smith was a real person who very likely just walked past the mansion and he probably caught a whiff of the smell of rotting dead bodies, and so he called it in. 4 months after Homer and Langley were found dead inside of their maze of trash, their mansion was declared a fire hazard and demolished. Today, there is a small park called the Collier Brothers Park, and it's filled with nothing but a couple of trees and a bench.